Now beginning. Story 1. The sand-worn walls of the kingdom of Aksum. You find yourself standing at the edge of an ancient terrace. The sun is hot, but it is a dry, intelligent heat, the kind that bakes knowledge into stone. All around you lies the ancient city of Aksum. It is not the Aksum of tourists and ruins. No, it is the Aksum of 2,000 years ago, alive with the muted clatter of carts carrying incense, the hushed rustle of papyrus in ledger rooms, and the deliberate footsteps of diplomats crossing courtyards to meet traders from as far away as India and Byzantium. Yet despite this crossroads of civilizations, the Aksumites built slowly, quietly. Their greatness did not erupt with conquest. It accumulated like silt, generation after generation. Foundations beneath the dust. By the 1st century CE, the kingdom of Aksum had begun to form in what is today northern Ethiopia and Eritrea. While most textbooks mention it briefly as a trading empire or a Christian kingdom, such simplifications do little justice to the slow, complex unfolding of its history. Aksum's rise was not sudden. It came as a result of location, patience, and attention to agricultural innovation. Its capital was situated just close enough to the Red Sea to benefit from trade, yet far enough inland to maintain independence from coastal raiders and imperial rivals. Its earliest structures were not grand, but functional. Rectangular stone foundations show evidence of grain storage, administrative meeting houses, and water management systems. These were the organs of a kingdom still learning to walk but already preparing to run. Farmers in the surrounding highlands developed terracing methods to conserve water using slow-dripping irrigation techniques. The process was tedious. Rocks had to be lifted, soil sorted, and pathways rerouted, all by hand. No quick reward came from this work, but in time the yields grew, and when they did, so did Aksum. Currency and quiet power. Aksum was one of the first African civilizations to mint its own coins, beginning in the 3rd century CE. This wasn't merely economic, it was ideological. The coins declared Aksum's independence from neighboring kingdoms and its inclusion in the global economy. These coins were not mass-produced for the sake of splendor. They were utilitarian, consistent, and bore inscriptions in both Greek and Ge'ez, signifying a deliberate diplomatic reach across cultural lines. Gold, silver, and bronze coins were used to measure not just wealth, but also time and legitimacy. They helped regulate taxation and were a subtle assertion of sovereignty. Aksum didn't need to conquer its neighbors to control trade. It only had to make its coinage desirable and trustworthy. Incense roots and the Red Sea. The incense trade was central to Aksum's early economy. Frankincense and myrrh, harvested painstakingly in the highlands, were transported through slow-moving caravans that threaded their way to Adulis, the kingdom's main port on the Red Sea. From Adulis, goods traveled to Arabia, India, and the eastern Mediterranean. But more than spices moved. So did ideas, scripts, and technologies. And all of it was catalogued, reviewed, and processed by Aksumite scribes whose names have long since been worn away by time. But while trade flowed, it was not chaotic. It was methodical. Ports had regulation systems. Customs posts had bureaucrats. Traders required permits. Aksum didn't build its wealth through brash expansion, but through policy and consistency. The unspoken faiths. Before Christianity became the dominant religion of Aksum, the kingdom was home to a layered spiritual landscape. Steely, tall, monolithic stone pillars dot the old city like bookmarks in a long-forgotten text. These stelae were burial markers, symbols of authority, and perhaps even spiritual antennae. Many were carved without words, their meaning held in their proportions and placement. The people of Aksum believed in continuity over rupture. The afterlife wasn't a break from life, it was a continuation of responsibility. Burial chambers were stocked with grain and pottery, sometimes even writing tools. The dead were expected to keep working silently. Architecture meant to last. Aksumite architecture relied heavily on carved stone blocks and mortise and tenon joints. No mortar, just precision and patience. Buildings were measured in generations. A father might lay the foundation stones for a complex that his son would build upon and his grandson would inhabit. The famous obelisks of Aksum, some weighing over 100 tons, were carved with stylized windows and doors mimicking the wooden homes of the elite. Why mimic something so ordinary in stone? Perhaps it was a declaration. Even the temporary can be made eternal if the work is done carefully enough. A slow conversion. It wasn't until the 4th century CE that Aksum officially adopted Christianity under King Ezana. But the process began long before that. Trade brought Christian merchants and missionaries into Aksumite cities. One such figure, Frumentius, a Syrian shipwreck survivor, found himself serving in the royal court. He eventually helped convert the king. Yet this conversion was not explosive. It was deliberate. Christian symbols began to appear gradually on coins. Churches were built quietly alongside older temples. The old gods were not erased overnight. They were slowly retired. Unresolved thought. How did a civilization so silent in its strength, so meticulous in its development, become almost invisible in the modern historical consciousness? You rejoin Aksum not at its beginning, but at the quiet crest of its power. The kingdom is now a firm, intentional presence in the Horn of Africa, a realm whose voice is not loud, but whose words reach the ears of distant emperors and merchants. The stones have been set, the irrigation systems carved, the scribes trained, and the merchant routes extended. Now, Aksum is no longer only watching the world, it is participating in it. But as the coins now bear crosses and Greek script inscriptions of Toytoapchristosnexwmitw, or "May this please the people of Aksum," the question turns. How did a deeply rooted indigenous kingdom blend its customs with foreign religion without breaking? The conversion that didn't break the past. King Ezana's conversion to Christianity around the mid-4th century CE marked a decisive, yet remarkably smooth shift in Aksumite identity. Unlike the religious reforms in other parts of the ancient world, often abrupt and enforced by decree, Aksum's transition was gradual and integrative. Frumentius, the Syrian Christian slave who had risen through the ranks of court, was later consecrated as bishop by the Patriarch of Alexandria. His role in the royal court gave Christianity an administrative foothold, but it did not erase existing customs. Rather, Christianity was woven into the fabric already present. Temples were not razed, they were reinterpreted. Some older structures were adapted into churches. Burial traditions persisted, now accompanied by crosses carved into stone and prayers in Ge'ez, the Aksumite language. Archaeologists have found inscriptions from this era that show traditional names alongside Christian blessings, a duality not of conflict, but of convergence. The people of Aksum had learned the value of maintaining continuity. Aksum and the global web. By the 5th century, Aksum's influence reached far beyond its borders. It had diplomatic recognition from both the Byzantine Empire and the Persian Sassanid dynasty. Roman and Byzantine coins have been found in Aksumite sites, sometimes hoarded for generations, not always for spending, but perhaps for the message they conveyed. We are in the world, and the world is in us. Christianity gave Aksum a shared language with Constantinople. Diplomatic exchanges included not just emissaries, but also theological texts, art, and architectural ideas. But unlike other Christian kingdoms, Aksum did not submit to external religious authority. The kingdom aligned itself with the Coptic Church of Egypt, which shared both geographic and theological proximity, particularly after the Council of Chalcedon, 451 CE, where Aksum, like Egypt, rejected Chalcedonian orthodoxy and followed the Miaphysite tradition. This seemingly small doctrinal difference carried enormous implications for how Aksum developed its own form of Christianity, introspective, independent, and steeped in local expression. Bureaucracy in the mountains. Power in Aksum wasn't defined only by kings and coins. Beneath the monarchy was a tiered structure of administrators, landholders, and scribes. While few written records survive, we know from inscriptions and archaeological studies that taxation, land grants, and legal decrees were all part of a sophisticated bureaucracy. Taxation was assessed in livestock, grain, and sometimes incense or honey, and scribes traveled to rural districts to measure fields and record harvests. The use of the Ge'ez script, carved into stone and etched into manuscripts, reveals a literacy that extended beyond the capital, slowly but steadily permeating regional centers. Aksumite record-keeping wasn't just for history, it was for management, and management was key to stability. The state's strength wasn't found in an army of overwhelming force, but in one of consistent paperwork. Architectural patience. The iconic steely fields of Aksum, containing obelisks that range from modest to monumental, continued to serve as a statement of ancestral reverence and civic identity. Some of these stelae, like the obelisk of Aksum, originally over 24 meters tall and weighing approximately 160 tons, are feats of engineering so precise that they challenge modern reconstructions of how they were moved and erected. But it wasn't just obelisks. By the 6th century, Aksumite architecture had evolved to include cross-shaped churches dug directly into rock, rectangular basilicas with stepped foundations, and throne platforms used for both ritual and civic administration. Builders used layered stone and mortar techniques known as monkey head architecture, inserting protruding beams for both structure and aesthetics. The effect was subtle but enduring, designed not to dazzle, but to persist. Some of these buildings were communal granaries or meeting halls, built with the foresight of leaders who knew that drought, rebellion, or famine would someday come, and that bureaucracy would need shelter too. The reach of trade, the quiet of control. Adulis, the main port city of Aksum, grew into one of the most important trading centers on the Red Sea. Goods came and went, ivory from the interior, glass from Rome, spices from India, and cloth from Egypt. But this flow wasn't free-form. It was regulated. Archaeological digs at Adulis suggest the presence of weighing stations, tax enclosures, and multilingual signage. Traders were required to declare cargo, and scribes likely recorded every arrival. Aksum understood what many empires did not, that prosperity without structure is short-lived. Even more intriguing, Aksum practiced what historians now call silent trade, with regions to the south and west, particularly with groups that spoke different languages or had no formal diplomatic relations. These exchanges were not built on verbal agreements, but on ritual and consistency. Goods were left at predetermined sites. Counterparts would arrive, inspect, leave a counteroffer, and depart. Trust wasn't verbalized. It was earned over time through reliability. Conflicts avoided and borders managed. Unlike its contemporaries in the Mediterranean and Middle East, Aksum's expansion was not primarily military. There were skirmishes and campaigns, most notably King Caleb's intervention in Himyar, modern-day Yemen, around the 6th century to protect Christian communities under threat, but these were exceptions, not norms. Instead, the kingdom focused on influence rather than annexation. Local leaders in peripheral areas were incorporated through tribute systems or marriages. Aksum's borders were permeable, and it allowed a range of semi-autonomous polities to remain within its economic and religious orbit without direct control. This governance model, slow absorption rather than forced centralization, reduced rebellion. People joined Aksum because it made life easier, not harder. Weaving identity, language, art, and everyday life. The Ge'ez script, developed for liturgical and administrative use, became a foundational element of Ethiopian Christian tradition. Unlike many ancient scripts that disappeared with their civilizations, Ge'ez survived as a liturgical language for centuries. Art in Aksum was not grandiose, it was intimate. Stone-carved crosses, ceramic oil lamps, and bone hair combs decorated with Christian motifs show the integration of faith into everyday objects. Domestic life was not ignored in Aksum's history. It was recorded in pottery, cooking tools, and jewelry. A clay spindle whorl, or a child's engraved wooden toy, tells us more about the people of Aksum than 1,000 royal decrees. High elevations and higher thinking. Aksum's highland geography offered strategic and environmental benefits. The elevation brought cooler temperatures, reduced the threat of malaria, and allowed for the development of highland cereals like teff, which would later become a staple in Ethiopian diets. Agriculture was experimental. Farmers rotated crops. Beekeeping was common, particularly for producing wax for candles and honey for trade. Stone terraces minimized erosion, conserving soil during heavy rains. This wasn't subsistence farming, it was surplus farming, and surplus meant planning, negotiation, storage, and record-keeping. Aksum wasn't a kingdom of conquerors, it was a kingdom of organizers. A candle in the historical wind. By the late 6th century, Aksum remained one of the three most powerful Christian empires in the world, alongside Byzantium and Armenia. But changes were coming. Trade routes began to shift. The rise of Islam would soon reshape the entire Red Sea economy. Climate change, soil depletion, and possibly political instability began to strain the system. The capital would eventually move further inland to escape pressure from desertification and incursions. But in this moment, this breath of time in the middle of the 6th century, Aksum was an empire with literacy, policy, and theology as its core. It had no gladiator arenas, no mass spectacles. Its greatness was not shouted. It was written, carved, and preserved in the deliberate silence of its stone. Unresolved thought. What happens to a kingdom that builds its greatness on patience, consensus, and planning when the external world begins to demand speed, control, and expansion? The wind has changed. Where once the ports of Adulis rang with the language of trade, where once scribes inked tallies onto papyrus, now there is quiet. Not sudden silence, but the kind that creeps like dusk over a field, like sediment gathering unnoticed. The fall of the kingdom of Aksum did not come with a single battle. It was not taken by fire or spear. Instead, it faded, step by step, until what was once a pillar of highland civilization became an echo. This section will walk with you through that long dusk, through the economic shifts, environmental stress, religious reorientations, and geopolitical pressures that wore Aksum down not with drama, but with attrition. And yet, the end of Aksum's prominence was not the end of its influence. Trade winds turn away. One of the clearest signs of Aksum's decline was its gradual disappearance from major trade records. Once noted in Roman, Persian, and Indian sources, it becomes a footnote by the 7th and 8th centuries. What changed? The Red Sea, which had been Aksum's lifeline to the world, shifted from open corridor to contested border. The rise of Islam in the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century redirected the region's trade focus. Mecca, Medina, and eventually Cairo became hubs of commerce and culture. New Islamic powers controlled maritime routes with increasing authority. Aksum, a Christian kingdom, found itself partially isolated not by conflict, but by irrelevance in this new map. Adulis, once bustling, fell into disuse. There is no record of a major battle or destruction there, just fewer ships, less incense, fewer scrolls to count. The Red Sea's shift was like the closing of a well-thumbed book, slowly, then finally. The heat of change, environmental decline. Archaeological and paleo-environmental evidence suggests that by the 7th century, Aksum was also facing a series of environmental challenges. The Ethiopian highlands experienced cycles of drought and soil degradation. Terrace farming, while effective for centuries, began to falter under the weight of population demands and possible overuse. Erosion stripped the slopes of their fertility. Deforestation, likely driven by timber needs for construction and fuel, reduced rainfall retention. Springs ran shallower. Grain yields declined. No single season doomed Aksum, but over decades the rhythm of reliable harvest slowed. And when agriculture wanes, so does taxation. And when taxation wanes, so does infrastructure, bureaucracy, and administration. In the Aksumite worldview, sustainability wasn't just ecological, it was political. And now, that delicate balance was tipping. Withdrawal from the lowlands. As the coastlines became less dependable and the soil less fertile, Aksum began to contract. Its capital moved from Aksum City to less documented highland locations, perhaps to better access remaining water resources, or to avoid the Arab incursions along the coast. This wasn't a panicked flight, it was a retraction, like a hand pulling inward when the fire grows too hot. This period of decentralization coincides with the fading of monumental architecture and coin minting. The last known Aksumite coin was issued in the mid-7th century. Its quality was poorer, its silver content low, and then nothing. Even so, inscriptions show that some form of local rule and administration continued. But the days of diplomatic embassies, empire-wide taxation, and standardized urban planning were done. The kingdom did not fall. It stepped back. The crescent and the cross. Islam's emergence as a global power did not wipe Aksum away, but it changed the conversation. Aksum's rulers, having once communicated with Byzantium and received bishops from Alexandria, now found themselves surrounded by Islamic polities. Egypt, the Hijaz, Nubia all shifted under new governance and faith. Interestingly, Aksum maintained peaceful relations with early Muslim communities. Islamic tradition records that during the Prophet Muhammad's lifetime, a group of persecuted Muslims found refuge in the kingdom of Aksum, protected by a just Christian king known as the Negus. This story, while filtered through religious memory, is widely accepted. It speaks to Aksum's diplomatic pragmatism. The kingdom did not fear Islam, but it also did not convert. Instead, it preserved its form of Miaphysite Christianity, in seclusion, tending to its faith even as the rest of the region evolved in new directions. This spiritual continuity would plant seeds for the next Ethiopian Christian kingdoms that emerged. Cultural transformation without collapse. Unlike many fallen empires, Aksum did not dissolve into chaos. Instead, it dissolved into continuity. Many of its institutions, language, religious texts, liturgy, and agricultural knowledge migrated inward, up into the mountains and monasteries that would become the cradles of later Ethiopian identity. The Zagwe dynasty, which rose in the 10th and 11th centuries, inherited much from Aksum. They continued the Christian traditions, preserved Ge'ez as a liturgical language, and famously commissioned the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela structures that mirror Aksumite techniques in spiritual stonework. Even after Aksum had vanished as a political entity, its worldview endured. You can hear it in the chants of monks in remote monasteries. You can see it in the illuminated manuscripts, painstakingly copied by hand in dim-lit scriptoria. You can trace it in the borders of religious festivals, which still follow Aksumite calendars. A legacy not meant for empire. Part of what made Aksum's legacy so unusual is that it was not designed for global permanence. Its architecture, its policies, its economy all were crafted with resilience and self-containment in mind. Aksum was never expansionist in the way of Rome or Persia. It did not build amphitheaters or colosseums to impress future tourists. Its splendor was in the details: the carved step in a stele, the precise language of a coin, the placement of a terrace stone. As a result, much of what Aksum achieved was overlooked by the broader world. Western historians, especially during colonial periods, often dismissed sub-Saharan Africa as a place without written history. Aksum, quite literally carved in script, proved them wrong. Yet even today, it is less discussed than its Mediterranean contemporaries. The tombs beneath the grass. Today in northern Ethiopia, the ruins of Aksum still rise. Some stelae lean precariously. Others lie broken, scattered as if thrown by time. Visitors walk quietly through the fields, perhaps imagining the ceremonies that once took place in the temples, now reduced to mossy foundations. Excavations continue. Beneath the dry grass and scattered stone lie burial chambers, grain silos, and administrative rooms. There are still more stories to uncover. In 2005, one of the largest Aksumite stelae once taken by Italian forces in the 1930s was returned and reinstalled. This return was not just symbolic. It was a recognition that Aksum was, and is, a foundation stone of African history. Not a relic of conquest, a blueprint of patience. Lessons in slow empire. The story of Aksum asks us to reconsider how we define power. Can a kingdom be strong without being loud? Can a people be great without expansion? Can an empire fall quietly and still leave behind something indelible? Aksum's answer is yes. It shows us that empire need not always be spectacle. Sometimes, it is the ledger that survives longer than the sword, the terrace wall that outlasts the palace. In a world that often favors the dramatic, Aksum built for duration. And in doing so, it did not vanish. It receded into memory where it continues to whisper, if you know how to listen. Final reflection. As you drift from this story, consider this. What might the world look like today if more kingdoms had followed Aksum's model? If power were measured in sustainability, diplomacy, and quiet integrity rather than expansion and force? Perhaps, like the stones of Aksum, the most enduring things are those built not to impress, but to last. Story 2. Tichit's Silent Stones, Life in the First Cities of West Africa. You are standing on dry stone walls, now broken and swallowed by the sands of the Sahara. The sun is relentless, the wind unrepentant. It's hard to imagine that here in modern-day southeastern Mauritania once stood some of the oldest organized human settlements in all of West Africa. But there was a time, long before the desert took hold, when this place was green, when millet swayed gently in the fields, when people shaped stones into terraces, corrals, and dwellings with neither fanfare nor empire, yet built something extraordinary in its quiet resilience. This is Tichit, also spelled Tichit, a place mostly forgotten by mainstream history books, a city before cities, a civilization that didn't conquer but cultivated, a people who measured success in food, not force. In this first section, we travel back nearly 4,000 years to examine how the earliest known West African complex society lived not in glory, but in the humble, practical genius of dryland survival. A different Sahara. The first and most important thing to understand about Tichit is this: the Sahara was not always desert. Around 2000 BCE, during the waning years of the African humid period, the region that would become southeastern Mauritania was semi-arid, but still capable of sustaining life. Grasses grew, seasonal lakes formed. Rainfall, while inconsistent, was present enough to support both agriculture and pastoralism. This transition from green to gold, from grassland to sand, is one of the quiet backdrops of West African prehistory. It happened slowly, over centuries, and the people of Tichit adapted in real time. They didn't abandon the land. They worked with it, Tichet society arose not because conditions were perfect, but because its people learned how to live with imperfection. Dry stone urbanism. The settlements of the Tichet tradition, also known as the Dihar Tichet culture, are among the oldest known stone-built settlements in West Africa, dating from roughly 1900 BCE to 400 BCE. They left no writing, no grand temples, no kings or monuments, but they left something just as remarkable: walls. Thousands of dry stone walls still mark the terrain. These structures weren't random. They were parts of organized compounds, rectangular or oval enclosures used for housing, grain storage, livestock corrals, and even defensive perimeters. No mortar was used. Stones were carefully selected and stacked, relying on balance, pressure, and deep knowledge of local geology. These walls didn't just organize space, they organized community. Each settlement was laid out with intention: narrow lanes, room clusters, communal areas. No two looked quite the same, yet all followed patterns that imply a shared understanding of property, hierarchy, and the rhythms of everyday life. This wasn't just architecture, it was philosophy rendered in rock. Farmers of millet and margin. Perhaps the most remarkable feature of Tichet society was its early reliance on pearl millet, Penistum glaucum, a hardy grain uniquely suited to the semi-arid Sahel environment. At a time when much of sub-Saharan Africa was still dominated by mobile hunter-gatherer groups or early pastoralists, the people of Tichet were already farming systematically, repeatedly, and at scale. Millet is a difficult crop. It requires precise timing and spacing. It is labor-intensive, but in return, it offers one of the most drought-resistant grains known to humanity. How do we know they farmed? Archaeobotanical remains, charred millet grains found in hearths and storage pits confirm its presence. Even more telling, settlement patterns show terracing, runoff control structures, and granaries. These were not casual foragers. These were engineers of survival. And they did so without rivers, without irrigation, just rainfall, stone, and grit. Herding in harmony. Agriculture was only half of the equation. Tichet society also relied heavily on pastoralism, particularly cattle, goats, and sheep. Evidence from rock art, pottery residue, and bone remains suggests that animal husbandry was central not just for meat, but for milk, hide, and status. What's fascinating is the integration between farming and herding. Fields were positioned near settlement cores, while livestock were rotated through peripheral zones. Fodder was stored in protected areas. Manure fertilized the fields. This wasn't just survival, it was planning. There was a rhythm to it: sow, harvest, graze, rest. The people of Tichet did not treat the land as disposable. They worked it in cycles. The dry stone corrals show that even the animals had a place in the order of things: protected, managed, respected. Pottery and the taste of daily life. Without texts, how do we hear the voices of the past? One answer is pottery. The Tichet tradition left behind vast quantities of ceramic fragments. These shards are not decorative, though some bear geometric patterns, but utilitarian. Their shapes suggest storage jars, cooking pots, and drinking vessels. Residue analysis has revealed traces of milk, oil, and fermented grains. These people not only ate to live, they had culture around food. There may have been rituals of cooking, perhaps even early forms of porridge or beer. Fired locally using open-pit kilns, the pottery shows variation between sites. Some settlements had finer ware, others coarser. Was this a sign of trade, regional identity, specialized production? We can only guess, but even in the guessing, we see a society with nuance. And nuance is a marker of civilization. Networks without empires. Tichet's settlements didn't exist in isolation. Over 500 distinct sites have been recorded along the rocky escarpments of the Dihar Tichet, Dihar Walata, and Dihar Nema regions. These settlements often sit atop ridges or plateaus, overlooking the seasonal basins below. This placement offered visibility, drainage, and perhaps even spiritual significance. Some larger sites, like Akrajit, show signs of administrative centrality, larger enclosures, more storage facilities, denser artifact layers. But there is no evidence of kings, armies, or palaces. This wasn't a state. It was a network, a confederation of villages and towns bound by shared practices, trade, and culture. Goods such as shell beads from the Atlantic coast and stone tools from hundreds of kilometers away suggest robust exchange systems. These were not isolated farmers. They were participants in a pre-literate West African web of interaction. Their currency wasn't coin, it was millet, cattle, knowledge. The Murmuring Stones. Tikrit is also home to one of the richest collections of rock art in the region. Carved into the escarpments are images of cattle, hunters, warriors, and geometric symbols. Some are deeply pecked, others are lightly etched. What do they mean? Some may have marked grazing routes or water access. Others could be totems, stories, or territorial claims. One recurring motif, parallel lines, could represent fields or enclosure walls. Unlike the written records of later empires, these carvings do not seek to immortalize a ruler or a conquest. They feel personal, everyday. The art of the ordinary. And in that, we hear a whisper of their worldview. That permanence comes not from domination, but from documentation, even if only in stone. An unwritten constitution. The absence of writing in Tikrit is often cited as a gap, but perhaps it's a gift. Without text to tell us what to think, we're left with structures, tools, and fragments, things that force us to reconstruct not just events, but values. From what we can tell, Tikrit society was decentralized but organized, hierarchical but not autocratic, agricultural but flexible, spiritual but practical. It offers a model of human complexity that defies the standard model of progress. There were no empires here, no iron, no wheels. And yet they built and stayed and adapted for over 1,000 years. Unresolved thought. What happens to a civilization that builds not for glory, but for balance? One that shapes stone not into towers, but into thresholds between field, family, and time. You are standing now not in a single settlement, but in a network, a mosaic of interconnected villages, each one shaped from stone and soil. The fields of millet are turning golden. The corrals are full. The walls stand firm. But behind these quiet routines lies a deeper story, one of evolving social structure, environmental change, and the ingenuity required to hold a civilization together when the very climate is shifting beneath your feet. In this section, we journey deeper into the Tikrit tradition, not to find monuments or kings, but to uncover how a decentralized yet organized society functioned. What do the shapes of their homes reveal about their culture? How did they respond to pressure from the encroaching desert? What allowed them to last 1,000 years? And what finally began to pull them apart? Patterns in stone, reading the layouts. While Tikrit left no written language, its architecture speaks volumes. By analyzing hundreds of settlement layouts, archaeologists have discovered consistent patterns. Core compounds larger, more complex enclosures, likely housing elders or prominent families. Peripheral units, smaller dwellings or corrals attached to the core, perhaps for junior members or laborers. Shared spaces, open courtyards, narrow passageways, and communal grinding stones suggest daily collaboration. These were not random aggregations of huts. They were carefully planned compounds, indicating social hierarchy not of kings and slaves, but of families, roles, and generational knowledge. Some settlements feature multi-level stone walls, allowing for air flow and privacy. Others include hidden storage pits and strategic access points. The decisions weren't about display. They were about control of space, labor, grain, and relationships. We don't know what they called these divisions, but they likely represented the unspoken rules of lineage, inheritance, and cooperation. In Titchit, architecture was law, the stone landscapes of power. While there is little evidence of centralized political authority, no royal tombs, no palaces, the presence of larger regional centers suggests some level of regional leadership. Sites like Akrajit and Dihar Walata feature denser clusters of buildings, more extensive storage, and even signs of specialized activity like metallurgy and bead making. These centers may have served as hubs for trade, seasonal gatherings, or ritual life. What's notable is how non-dominant they appear. There is no evidence that these centers ruled the smaller villages with force. Instead, they may have functioned more like capitals of consensus, where decisions were negotiated, not decreed. Some scholars propose that councils of elders or spiritual leaders mediated disputes and oversaw grain distribution roles of quiet power rather than spectacle. In Titchit, control wasn't enforced through armies. It was embedded in routine, in infrastructure, in who held the keys to the storage pits. Grain is wealth, not gold. Unlike later empires whose economies revolved around tribute, slaves, or precious metals, Titchit's economy was rooted in subsistence plus surplus. Millet and livestock were not just food, they were wealth. Grain was stored in raised stone silos or pits lined with clay. Livestock were kept in corrals whose capacity likely correlated with social standing. A family with 3 cows, 20 goats, and a full granary wasn't rich in the abstract, they were secure, and that was enough. This system fostered a different kind of wealth, distributed and embedded in the landscape. There was no mint, no taxation bureau, just stones, seeds, and slow accumulation. Yet somehow, this grain-based economy lasted for over a millennium, longer than many coin-based ones. The sand creeps closer. As the centuries passed, something subtle but profound began to shift. The rains became less reliable, the seasonal ponds stayed dry longer, the grasslands receded. The Sahara was growing not as a wall of sand, but as a slow-moving gradient. Year by year, arable land shrank, pasture land diminished. People responded with innovation. Settlements migrated to more protected cliffs and escarpments. Terraces were built to trap runoff. Storage capacity increased, suggesting a growing need to buffer against bad seasons. But these adaptations had limits. Some smaller settlements were abandoned altogether, their stones left to the wind. Larger ones grew denser, possibly absorbing displaced populations. Archaeological layers from the late 2nd millennium BCE show a shift in material culture: simpler pottery, more emphasis on storage, less on trade goods. These aren't signs of collapse, but of retreat. The people of Titchit were trying to hold the line against an enemy you couldn't see: climate change, migrations, and memory. By around 500 BCE, many of the Dihar Titchit settlements had been abandoned. The stone walls still stood, but the fields were fallow. The desert had finally pushed too far. But this was not extinction, it was migration. Many scholars believe that the descendants of the Titchit tradition moved southward and eastward into what are now Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, taking with them their millet, herding strategies, and social structures. One key hypothesis connects these migrants with the emergence of the Ghana Empire centuries later. Though the Ghana Empire, centered further south, is better known for gold trade and Islamic scholarship, its earliest layer of settlement shows echoes of Titchit: clustered villages, mixed farming and herding, and stone foundations. In other words, Titchit may have become invisible but not irrelevant. Its people moved, its culture adapted, and its memory lived on, not in books but in practices. Echoes in pottery and hearth. One of the most powerful tools in archaeology is ceramic analysis. And in the case of Titchet, pottery tells a story of resilience and continuity. Distinctive decorative patterns, wavy lines, zigzags, punctuations appear not just in Titchet, but in later sites along the Niger River and even in Sahelian regions hundreds of kilometers away. These patterns are more than decoration. They are cultural fingerprints, linking communities across time and space. The shape of a pot, the clay used, the burn marks from cooking all serve as clues. And what they tell us is this: the people who once built stone cities in Mauritania didn't disappear. They kept cooking, kept farming, kept moving. History often favors those who stay put, but the Titchet legacy lies in movement with memory. Spiritual life in stone. What did the people of Titchet believe? There are no temples, no idols, no written prayers, but the clues remain. Burial practices suggest respect for ancestry. Some graves are marked with small stone circles or cairns, others with offerings of pottery or tools. Rock art depicts not just animals and people, but abstract symbols, circles, crosses, patterns whose meaning remains elusive. Certain settlement alignments may correspond with celestial events, the movement of stars, solstices, or seasons. Rather than a single religious system, Titchet likely practiced localized spirituality tied to place, rainfall, herd health, and ancestral memory. Their sacred sites weren't cathedrals, they were cliffs, wells, trees. Their theology wasn't written. It was performed in how they planted, how they stored, how they remembered. Decline without disaster. Titchet's story doesn't end with flames or ruins. It ends with dispersal. The population gradually fragmented. The land dried further. Stone walls were no longer worth maintaining. People took their livestock, their seeds, their stories, and left. This slow fatting challenges our typical narratives of civilizational collapse. There was no Pompeii, no sacking army, no sudden loss. Only the recognition that staying was no longer viable. It is a kind of resilient failure, one that recognizes limits and chooses survival over legacy. Unresolved thought. If the people of Titchet had written their own history, what would they have recorded? Would they have spoken of kings and wars, or of drought and harvest, migration and memory? And what might we learn from a civilization that survived not through conquest, but through careful balance with a changing world? Now you walk through time itself. Wind whispers through the broken walls of the ancient compounds. Tiny tufts of grass push through the cracks between stones that haven't been touched in over 2,000 years. Above you, the Saharan sky stretches wide, vast, and unfeeling. But beneath your feet lies the echo of a civilization that lasted longer than many of the ones celebrated in textbooks. In this final section, we will examine what became of the people of Titchet, how modern archaeology rediscovered them, and how their slow, deliberate existence reshapes how we think about civilization itself. The world forgot Titchet for centuries, but the land did not. National the people who moved on. By 400 BCE, the stone cities of Titchet were mostly abandoned. The desert had claimed the millet fields. The cattle paths had grown dry, but the people, resilient, knowledgeable, mobile, did not vanish. They moved south and east, taking with them their knowledge of dryland farming techniques, granary construction, mixed economies of agriculture and herding, social organization without rigid kingship. Some scholars believe that the social and cultural traditions of Titchet formed the substratum of later West African civilizations, including the Ghana Empire and even elements of early Mali. While the Ghana Empire would be known for gold and trade, the early layers of Ghana's development, its early settlements and agricultural zones, mirror the architectural DNA of Titchet. Stone foundations, millet farming, and decentralized administration. In this way, Titchet never truly disappeared. It transformed. Compass memory without monuments. Civilizations are often remembered by what they leave behind: ziggurats, pyramids, libraries, palaces. But what happens when a society leaves behind useful knowledge instead of ruins? Tichet didn't produce vast temples. Its cities weren't places of conquest or record-keeping, but it normalized millet farming in West Africa, a crop that remains a staple today across the Sahel. It refined dryland settlement strategies, terracing, rainwater management, and rotation grazing that are still used by pastoralists in Mauritania and Mali. It left behind social models that balanced hierarchy with cooperation, family lineage with community needs. And yet, because Tichet wrote no texts and had no goal to attract invaders or explorers, its story faded from human memory. Only the stones remembered. Test tube rediscovery by archaeology. It wasn't until the mid-20th century that Tichet returned to the human imagination through the work of archaeologists like Henry Lote, Raymond Mauney, and later, Augustin Hall. These researchers began mapping the Dihar escarpments, the long ridges of stone that rise from the Mauritanian sands, and realized they weren't just random formations. They were engineered landscapes. They uncovered granary pits still marked by clay linings, pottery shards with distinctive decorative motifs, livestock corrals that mirrored ethnographic records of more recent Fulani and Soninke practices, stone circles and burial mounds, some aligned with astronomical features. And perhaps most powerfully, they found a timeline, a stretch of human occupation from 1900 BCE to 400 BCE, longer than the Roman Republic. Suddenly, West African history was no longer only about medieval empires or colonial maps. It had a deep past, DNA cultural legacy in the Sahel. Tichet's cultural influence lives on in several modern Sahelian practices. Seasonal transhumance, where herders move their animals between highland and lowland pastures, echoes ancient pastoral rhythms. Rain-fed millet farming, with its reliance on soil memory and storm prediction, still defines subsistence farming in parts of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Stone architecture, used in small village storage buildings, reflects centuries of knowledge about stability, airflow, and heat management. Even oral traditions in groups like the Soninke, the people often associated with early Ghana, tell of ancient stone towns abandoned to the desert. Whether myth or memory, these stories suggest a long chain of recollection. The thread may have frayed, but it was never cut. Books: what civilization really means. Western historical models often define civilization by a narrow checklist: writing, monumental architecture, centralized governance, military expansion. Tichet had none of these. And yet it sustained settlements for over 1,000 years, developed one of West Africa's earliest agripastoral economies, constructed urban compounds and community infrastructure, managed complex climatic challenges with local adaptation, participated in regional exchange networks. Is this not civilization? Tichet compels us to redefine what it means to be advanced, not in terms of conquest or grandeur, but in terms of endurance, adaptation, and thoughtful balance with the land. Derelict: the sound of slow collapse. Unlike so many civilizations that ended in sudden violence, Tichet's decline was a slow sigh, a drying well, a harvest missed, a caravan that didn't return. The people of Tichet did not cling to greatness. They left when they had to, carrying what mattered most: seed knowledge, herding roots, and an ethic of community resilience. In this way, the fall of Tichet is less a tragedy than a migration of wisdom. And the ruins they left behind are not tombs. They are instructions written in stone. Candle final reflection. As you prepare to drift from this story, let your mind rest not on emperors or golden palaces, but on a quiet field of millet. Imagine a family gathering at dusk, storing their grain, repairing their walls, telling stories beneath the stars. They will not be remembered by name, but they shaped the soil, and that is its own kind of legacy. So ask yourself, how many other civilizations have we forgotten simply because they chose to survive, rather than impress? Story 3. Ibo Ukwu and the Bronze Without War. It begins not with a throne, but with a pit. A man is digging a well in his backyard in 1938 in the quiet southeastern Nigerian town of Ibo Ukwu. His shovel strikes something hard: metal, clay, and beadwork tangled together in the dirt. At first, it seems like a fluke, a buried shrine perhaps. But what the man uncovered was no simple offering. It was a portal. A few meters below the surface lay the remains of one of the oldest and most sophisticated metalworking cultures in sub-Saharan Africa. Carefully crafted bronze vessels, iron tools, ceremonial regalia, and glass beads that had traveled from across the world, all buried, silently, beneath his home. And yet there are no signs of war, no palaces, no empire. Just exquisite craftsmanship, patient metallurgy, and the mystery of a civilization that left almost no trace of itself except in the shimmer of bronze. This is Ibo Ukwu, and in this section we'll examine the beginning of this story. A society that valued art over arms, bronze over blood, and ceremony over conquest. Magnifying glass tilted left a discovery in the soil. In 1938, Isaiah Anozie, a local villager, unearthed what would come to be known as the Ibo Ukwu bronzes. Though he could not have known it at the time, he had stumbled onto a 13th century BCE mystery, one that would upend assumptions about West African technological history. Eventually, excavations by British archaeologist Thurston Shaw in the 1950s and 60s revealed three major sites. Ibo Isaiah, a ritual deposit site, the original discovery. Ibo Richard, a burial site containing regalia, weapons, and ornamental items. Ibo Jonah, a dwelling and storage area, with domestic tools and refuse. Together, these sites offered one of the most detailed snapshots of an early West African elite culture, distinct from any known centralized kingdom, yet dripping with wealth, artistry, and external contact. Hammer the bronzes themselves. The bronzes of Ibo Ukwu are not merely tools or weapons, they are masterworks. They include ornately decorated ritual vessels, bowls, jugs, and pendants shaped like animals and abstract patterns, beaded regalia likely worn by priests or spiritual leaders, staff finials, bracelets, and anklets with intricate looping designs, sculpted gourds, ropes, and cloth patterns in metal. What makes them astonishing is not just their beauty, but the technique. The metalworkers used lost wax casting, a complex and labor-intensive process that involves creating a wax model, covering it in clay, melting the wax out, and then pouring in molten metal. Even today, reproducing these works would be difficult, and yet these artists did so without forges, without written manuals, without external help. Their work predates the more famous Benin bronzes by centuries, and they did it inland, not in a port city influenced by European contact, but in a modest community surrounded by forest and farmland. Globe showing Europe-Africa global beads, local genius. Among the bronze artifacts were thousands of glass beads, many of which originated as far away as Venice, Mesopotamia, and India. How they arrived in inland Nigeria is unclear, but their presence indicates that Ibo Ukwu was connected, however indirectly, to global trade networks. And yet there are no nearby ports, no imperial roads, no coinage. These weren't items of conquest. They were selective imports, likely filtered through generations of regional trade, arriving not as commodities but as sacred or ceremonial objects. They weren't used as currency. They were buried with priests and nobles. This suggests a spiritual economy, one in which value was not measured by accumulation, but by symbolism. In Ibo Ukwu, wealth wasn't flaunted, it was consecrated. DNA no kingdom, no empire. This is where the story deepens. Despite the richness of the artifacts and the sophistication of the technology, there is no evidence of an organized kingdom or military-based state in Ibo Ukwu's early history. There are no fortifications, no written decrees, no central palace, no tribute system, no warrior class. Instead, what archaeologists found points to a priestly elite, a class of ritual specialists who wielded influence through religious ceremony, not warfare. The regalia, the burial placement, and the symbolic designs all suggest that spiritual authority, rather than political power, was the organizing principle. In many cultures, metallurgy is associated with ritual. The act of transforming ore into metal was viewed as a kind of sacred transmutation. In Ibo Ukwu, this spiritual reverence seems to have formed the basis for social structure. Bricks houses, not halls. The dwellings found at the Ibo Jonah site were not palatial. They were circular huts built with mud and thatch, domestic in scale, personal. But inside these homes were elaborate tools, carefully crafted beads, and high-status items. This contrast between modest architecture and sophisticated art challenges modern assumptions. There were no golden roofs, no towering gates, but inside those walls people were experimenting, creating, storing knowledge, and organizing ritual life with incredible precision. Here, civilization wasn't measured in height, it was measured in detail. Crystal ball symbolism in every detail. The motifs on the bronzes are not random, they include snakes often associated with wisdom, renewal, or the divine. Tightly coiled spirals, possibly symbolizing continuity or the cosmos. Animal forms, including rams, birds, and leopards, linked to various ritual meanings. Textile patterns, suggesting the importance of cloth, weaving, or status garments. This level of symbolic language implies a shared cosmology, a worldview passed orally, visually, and through performance. Though we don't have their prayers or myths recorded, the bronzes act as a silent scripture, revealing a system of meaning that valued precision, balance, and the fusion of the natural and the spiritual. Of a culture without conquest. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Ibo Ukwu is what is missing: violence. There are no mass graves, no burnt layers of destruction, no weapon caches or scars of battle. The few weapons found, spears, knives, are ceremonial, not militarized. There is no evidence of territorial expansion, no signs of warlords or elite warriors. This was a society that advanced technologically and spiritually, without needing to dominate its neighbors. It reminds us that human creativity at its most exquisite does not require empire, that art can thrive without hierarchy, that technology can emerge from ritual, not conquest. Stop sign unresolved thought. How did such a brilliant and spiritually rich society leave behind so little beyond its bronzes? And what does it mean that they mastered metallurgy before mastering war? You return to Ibo Ukwu, not to a battlefield or a market square, but to the inside of a shrine. It's quiet, dark. The walls are thick with the scent of clay and long-cooled metal. A priest kneels before a sculpted vessel, his robe shimmering with tiny beads sewn by hand. He does not speak. He works in silence, layering ash, oil, and fragments of cloth into a ceremonial jar. Around him, bronze ornaments hang, some shaped like gourds, others like twisted cords or coiled snakes. There are no soldiers here, no trumpets, just ceremony. In this section, we look deeper into the ritual heart of the Ibo Ukwu culture, its spiritual beliefs, social structures, and symbolic systems. If Section 1 showed us the what, here we begin to explore the why. What kind of society puts such artistry into the tools of worship, but leaves no trace of political ambition? What belief system drives a people to bury such wealth, not display it? The answers are not always clear, but the clues are embedded in metal, myth, and memory. Counterclockwise arrows button a culture rooted in continuity. The people of Igbo Ukwu did not invent metallurgy in isolation. Their techniques likely evolved over centuries of cultural development and contact with broader West African traditions. But the lost wax casting method they perfected required knowledge that was generational. The creation of a single intricate object could take weeks, involving sculpting a wax model with precise detail, coating it in multiple layers of fine clay, drying and heating the mold to melt out the wax, pouring molten bronze and alloy of copper and tin into the cavity, cooling, breaking the mold, and finishing by hand. Each step had to be correct. There was no margin for error. This ritualized process mirrored the values of the culture: order, patience, continuity. Just as a priest performed a ceremony step by step, a metallurgist shaped meaning into matter. The two roles may have overlapped. In Igbo Ukwu, to shape bronze was to shape belief. Chain symbolic object, sacred tools. Among the recovered items at Igbo Ukwu are vessels and regalia that served no utilitarian purpose. They were too delicate for daily use, too ornate for travel. Some examples include a bronze pendant shaped like an elephant tusk, coiled like a rope. A miniature gourd covered in patterns that replicate traditional leatherwork, entirely cast in bronze. A ceremonial staff, notched and coiled, with inlays of copper and beads. These objects weren't just symbols of wealth, they were technological prayers, forged to communicate with deities, ancestors, or forces unseen. Scholars believe many of these items were part of a ritual deposit, buried intentionally as part of spiritual practice. Some may have been offerings, others tools for communicating with the spirit world, but they were never retrieved. They were left to rest. Burial in this context wasn't disposal, it was consecration. Mage the priesthood and ritual hierarchy. The absence of centralized political authority at Igbo Ukwu suggests that spiritual leaders were the main figures of influence. While there's no evidence of a monarch or kingdom in the traditional sense, the elaborate regalia and grave goods found at Igbo Richard point to an individual of very high status, most likely a priest-king or a spiritual custodian. This figure was buried with bronze pendants, hundreds of glass beads, iron tools, carved ivory ornaments, ritual vessels. The burial suggests a person who mediated between realms, the physical and the divine. Such a figure would have controlled knowledge, ritual timing, and access to sacred materials. In many traditional Igbo societies, as well as other Niger-Congo-speaking cultures, title societies and age grades played vital roles. While we cannot project modern Igbo institutions directly onto the past, it's plausible that similar structures existed in embryonic form. Elders overseeing seasonal ceremonies, custodians of sacred groves, specialist metalworkers initiated into secret knowledge. Power in Igbo Ukwu was likely relational, not absolute. Influence was earned through ritual authority, not conquest. Prayer beads, the beads and what they meant. Over 70,000 glass and carnelian beads were discovered across the Igbo Ukwu, sites many imported from as far as the Middle East and India. But their presence is not evidence of large-scale trade. Rather, they were rare, selected, and symbolically charged. Beads in West African cultures often signify fertility and life, spiritual protection, lineage and identity, title and status. In burial contexts, beads act as currency for the afterlife, or as markers of a person's role in life. At Igbo Ukwu, the sheer number and arrangement of beads point toward ritual preparation of the dead, possibly involving multiple ceremonies, layered offerings, and spiritual sealing. These beads, stitched onto cloth or buried in clusters, formed a visual theology. A body dressed in beads was a body spoken for a message sent across dimensions. Hold the underground chambers. One of the most mysterious features of the Ibo Isaiah site is the ritual pit, a deep, cylindrical chamber into which many of the bronze objects were placed, along with animal bones, pottery, and shells. The pit shows evidence of multiple episodes of deposition, suggesting it wasn't a one-time burial, but an ongoing ritual site. The layering of objects, the precision of placement, and the inclusion of non-local items, such as seashells from hundreds of kilometers away, point to a long-standing tradition of sacred accumulation. This wasn't garbage. It was liturgical geology, a vertical archive of belief. Over time, such pits may have been covered over, sealed with ceremony, and forgotten until unearthed by accident nearly 2,000 years later. Balance the absence of empire. What we don't find at Ibo Ukwu is as revealing as what we do. No administrative buildings. No signs of taxation. No coinage or accounting tools. No walls or weapons caches. No monuments glorifying a leader. This lack of state indicators suggests a different model of complexity, one based on ritual networks, not bureaucratic ones. Power likely radiated outward from sacred centers, following the rhythms of seasonal festivals, ancestral worship, and artisan guilds. This structure may seem fragile to modern minds, but it worked, and it allowed aesthetic innovation and religious coherence to flourish without conquest or colonization. DNA connection to later traditions. Ibo Ukwu's direct descendants remain unclear, but cultural echoes survive. In later Ibo societies, we find title-taking ceremonies like Ozo, reserved for men of accomplishment and moral authority. Ritual specialists known as Dibia, who manage healing, divination, and spiritual matters. Sacred groves and altars used for offerings to deities and ancestors. Masquerade traditions, where spiritual beings are represented through elaborate costumes and performances. Bead regalia and bronze ornamentation used in prestige events. It's possible that Ibo Ukwu represents the spiritual and artistic root system from which these traditions blossomed. Though time, migration, and external influences have changed the surface, the ritual logic remains. Continuity without collapse. There is no evidence that Ibo Ukwu collapsed. It seems to have evolved, perhaps absorbed into shifting patterns of population, environmental changes, or emerging regional trade. The sites were not destroyed, they were closed. What happened to the priests and artists? Did they move, change roles, leave their sacred items behind as part of a cosmological cycle? We don't know. But the absence of destruction implies a voluntary transition, not a forced one. Unresolved thought. Why would a people pour such genius and labor into objects meant not to be displayed, but buried? What kind of civilization measures greatness in secrecy, precision, and faith? The final bronze is lowered into the earth. It rests on a layer of beads wrapped in cloth, surrounded by symbols, snakes, spirals, animals. The priest adjusts the vessel slightly, making sure it leans just so. There are no chants, no audience, just the gravity of the act. He seals the chamber and steps away. In that moment, a story is closed, not destroyed, not erased, but preserved in silence. Buried not to be forgotten, but to be honored. In this final section of the story of Ibo Ukwu, we explore what happened after the bronzes were buried, how their legacy reverberates through later African art, how their memory was obscured by colonial narratives, and what their rediscovery tells us about the nature of civilization. What do we do with a culture that never shouted, never conquered, never spread, yet left behind one of the most intricate artistic traditions, the continent has ever known. Threads into the future. Though Ibo Ukwu, as a distinct archaeological culture, seemed to fade after the 10th century CE, its aesthetic fingerprints persisted. The craftsmanship of its bronzes, especially the lost wax technique, shows striking parallels to the later works of the Benin Kingdom in modern Nigeria, Ife Kingdom, Yorubaland, Nupe and Sode cultures. It's important not to conflate these cultures. Each had their own histories, worldviews, and innovations. But the technological and symbolic continuities suggest lines of influence, however indirect. Coiling motifs, animal symbolism, and ritual vessels continue to appear. The concept of metal as sacred, and its producers as ritual specialists, remains a strong theme. In later Ibo and Yoruba traditions, bronze and bead regalia are still worn by title holders, chiefs, and priests. Whether through migration, trade, or shared cultural cosmologies, the spirit of Ibo Ukwu did not vanish. It was reincarnated again and again through form, function, and faith. Stop sign, a civilization hidden by historiography. Why then did the world forget? Part of the answer lies in colonial historiography. For much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, European scholars viewed Africa through a narrow, often dismissive lens. The idea that sophisticated metallurgy and aesthetic complexity could have arisen independently in sub-Saharan Africa did not align with colonial narratives. When the Ibo Ukwu bronzes were first examined, some European experts suggested without evidence that the artifacts must have come from Egypt, Phoenicia, or even Portuguese traders. They couldn't imagine that Africans, deep inland, could cast bronze with such precision without foreign instruction. It took decades and the persistent work of African and Africanist archaeologists to dismantle these assumptions. Today, Ibo Ukwu stands not as an exception, but as proof of the long, deep arc of West African innovation. Test tube what the archaeology still tells us. Excavations of Ibo Ukwu continue to yield new information. Radiocarbon dating places the primary ritual burials between 851,000 CE, several centuries before the rise of Benin. Soil analysis shows that the sites were part of an interconnected settlement landscape, not isolated villages, but a mosaic of communities linked by kinship and ritual. Material comparisons suggest localized ore smelting, contradicting theories that the copper was imported in ingots or finished goods. Most importantly, the artifacts continue to speak through metallurgy, beadwork, and placement. Each vessel, each pendant, each buried staff reveals a detail about how the people of Ibo Ukwu lived, believed, and created. They may not have written scrolls, but they wrote in metal. The mirror of Ibo Ukwu. Ibo Ukwu is not just an archaeological site. It's a mirror reflecting back the limitations of how we define civilization. Western historiography often privileges expansion, centralized statecraft, writing systems, monumental architecture, warfare, and political drama. But Ibo Ukwu presents an alternative model: spiritual authority over political hierarchy, precision craftsmanship instead of monumental scale, economic connectivity without military expansion, deep ritual logic in place of court records. It challenges us to ask, is greatness measured by how loudly a culture proclaims itself, or by the depth and endurance of its values? Ibo Ukwu chose the latter. Globe showing Europe, Africa the global context. In global comparative terms, Ibo Ukwu stands alongside Pre-Inca metallurgy in the Andes, Shang Dynasty bronze works in China, Indus Valley bead traditions, Moche ritual sites in Peru. But while these cultures are often studied as part of world civilization, Ibo Ukwu is still rarely mentioned beyond Africanist circles. That silence reflects not the site's insignificance, but the gaps in global historical consciousness, gaps created by centuries of neglect, racism, and academic myopia. To place Ibo Ukwu back into the global narrative is not an act of charity. It is an act of correction. Scroll what the bronzes teach us. Each Ibo Ukwu object buried for centuries teaches a quiet lesson. That craftsmanship can be sacred. That meaning need not be monumental. That technology can emerge from ceremony, not conquest. That spiritual economies can be as enduring as market ones. That value lies not in accumulation, but in what is chosen to be buried, not sold. These bronzes are not relics. They are testimonies, and each one says, "We were here, we knew beauty, we shaped time with our hands." Cultural reverberations today. In modern Nigeria, Ibo Ukwu still exists, now a town with roads, schools, and daily life. But it also remains a site of cultural pride, especially for the Ibo people, many of whom see the site as a symbol of pre-colonial excellence and self-definition. Contemporary Ibo metalworkers, beadmakers, and carvers continue traditions that, consciously or not, echo their ancestors. Museums, too, are finally beginning to reframe the narrative. The National Museum in Lagos and the British Museum display Ibo Ukwu bronzes with increasing accuracy and care. Efforts for repatriation and ethical display are growing. African scholars are leading excavations and interpretive work, ensuring that the story is told from within, not just from afar. Ibo Ukwu's silence is being broken, but on its own terms. Candle final reflection. The people of Ibo Ukwu never raised a flag. They did not build walls or wage war or write epics, but they cast meaning into metal. They buried wealth not to hoard it, but to honor something larger than themselves. Their civilization did not collapse, it rested. And so we ask, how many more stories like Ibo Ukwu remain buried not just in the ground, but beneath the assumptions we carry about what civilization is supposed to look like? Story 4. The Weavers of Telem, echoes from the cliffs of Bandiagara. In the high cliffs of Bandiagara, where the rocks blush red in the Sahelian sun, dwellings cling to the escarpment like memories that refuse to fall. Some are carved directly into the cliff face. Others are built with clay and timber, balanced hundreds of feet above the valley floor. From below, they look like nests for forgotten birds, abandoned yet still watching. These are the homes, shrines, and granaries of the Telem people, a civilization that lived in these cliffs long before the Dogon came. They did not build cities or wage wars. They wove cloth. They mummified their dead. They climbed high to escape the reach of flood and fire. And yet little is known about them. Their voices have faded. Their names are unknown. But the things they left behind, textiles, pottery, burial bundles, speak of a people who understood space, material, and time in ways we are only beginning to rediscover. This is the story of the Telem, a story told not from thrones, but from ledges. National The Cliffs of Bandiagara. The Bandiagara escarpment runs for over 150 kilometers across present-day Mali. Rising in places more than 500 meters above the plains, it forms a natural wall between the semi-arid Sahel and the harsher Sahara beyond. It is here, embedded in the rock faces, that the Telem built their world. Unlike typical settlements on flat land, the Telem constructed their homes in vertical space, wedging dwellings into narrow fissures, building granaries on outcrops, and creating staircases from stone and timber that wind impossibly upward. These were not merely defensive positions, though they did offer protection. They were ecological solutions, elevated homes shielded from floods, pests, and the harshest sun. To climb is to survive, and to settle in the cliffs is to say, we will not be moved by the ground's chaos below. Bricks, clay, and wood, the architecture of adaptation. Telem architecture, reveals a remarkable understanding of environment and engineering. Their structures were primarily built using sun-dried mud bricks banco, millet stalks and wood beams, stone foundations shaped to match uneven rock faces. The walls were often rounded or curved to fit into niches. Roofs were thatched or layered with clay. Entryways were small, likely to retain warmth during cold nights and to deter animals or uninvited humans. Many granaries, still visible today, resemble small beehive-like cylinders perched above the ground. Their raised platforms kept grain safe from rodents and moisture. Some still contain millet seeds, untouched for centuries. Even more impressive, many of these structures still stand despite centuries of exposure to wind, rain, and erosion. Longevity was not an accident, it was a design principle. Thread textiles in the sky. The tellum were renowned, though only discovered much later, for their weaving. In dry caves and sheltered cliff dwellings, archaeologists have uncovered loom-weighted textiles, woven tunics and wraps, dyed fabric fragments preserved by the dry air, plant fibers twisted into cords, slings, and nets. This is one of the oldest and best preserved textile collections in Africa. Some pieces date back to the 11th and 12th centuries CE, though the tellum likely lived in the area well before that. Their cloth was made primarily from fibers like raffia and cotton, sometimes dyed using iron-rich mud or plant-based colorants. What makes these finds remarkable is not just their age, but their intention. Many cloths were found in burial contexts, wrapped tightly around bodies, layered with care. These were not scraps. They were offerings, identifiers, perhaps even textiles of passage meant to accompany the dead into the next world. In tellum belief, fabric was more than clothing. It was memory. Compass a people between worlds. So who were the tellum? We know little from their own words. They left no writing system, no known language records. Most of what we know comes from archaeological excavations of burial caves and cliff structures, material culture, tools, pottery, and weaving instruments, oral traditions from the Dogon people, who arrived in the region centuries later. According to Dogon oral accounts, the tellum were already established in the cliffs when the Dogon migrated into the area around the 14th or 15th century. The word tellum itself may be a Dogon term, loosely translated as "we found them" or "the ones we met." This suggests that by the time of contact, the tellum had already begun to fade, perhaps through migration, assimilation, or spiritual retreat. Their disappearance is not recorded as a war, but as a withdrawal into memory. Funeral burial practices and the afterlife. Tellum burial traditions are among the most distinctive in West African history. Bodies were placed in high-altitude caves, often in fetal positions, wrapped in multiple layers of textile. Surrounding them were pottery, simple, hand-shaped vessels, personal belongings, iron tools, jewelry, carved wooden figurines, animal remains, possibly ritual or dietary offerings. Some mummification appears accidental, the result of arid, cool cave environments, but some was likely intentional, given the placement and wrapping techniques. The dead were not interred beneath the ground. They were elevated, almost as if placed closer to the sky. This suggests a cosmology in which height equaled holiness, a bridge between earth and spirit. These burial caves have become archaeological time capsules, yielding objects of art, faith, and daily life that would have decayed elsewhere. In death, the tellum left their most detailed autobiography. Basket daily tools, subtle technologies. Beyond the textiles and burials, the tellum left behind tools that speak to a quietly sophisticated life. Stone grinders for processing millet. Bone and iron needles, likely for sewing or skin piercing. Wooden combs and spoons, carved with geometric designs. Basketry, some of which survives intact. These weren't luxury items. They were functional, humble, and deeply local, crafted with the materials at hand. But each bears signs of care, smoothness, symmetry, utility refined by repetition. Like the people of Tichit and Ibo Ukwu, the Telem seem to have built lives around discipline and detail, not dominance. What happened to the Telem? This remains a central mystery. By the 14th or 15th century, Dogon communities began settling in the region. They constructed new homes, often near or within older Telem structures. They adopted the cliff lifestyle, but also added their own religious and social systems. Dogon oral tradition speaks of the Telem as spirit people, sky dwellers, or ancestral predecessors. In some accounts, they are respected, in others feared, a duality common in cultural memory. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Telem may have migrated due to climate stress, resource depletion, or social pressures, intermarried with incoming groups, spiritualized, turning from the material to the sacred, or gradually dissolved as their structures were reused and repurposed. No massacre, no sudden fall. Just absence, like a song fading before the last verse. Unresolved thought. Why did the Telem climb so high to live, to bury, to remember? What did they know about the land or the sky that made them choose such difficult ground? Morning mist clings to the rock face. In the Bandiagara cliffs, time moves differently. The winds carry both dust and memory. Shadows shift along stone walls where no one walks, and birds nest in ledges once used for watching the sky, burying the dead, or weaving in silence. The Dogon now live here. They build, farm, and worship along these same escarpments, but in homes crafted more recently, beside and sometimes within the ancient dwellings of the Telem. And in their stories, the Telem are not just ancestors, they are spirits, people of the sky, remembered with awe and ambivalence. In this second section of the Telem story, we trace what came after, how the Dogon inherited, adapted, and preserved pieces of this cliff-dwelling culture, and how the Telem survive in whispers, in woven memory, and in the structure of the cliffs themselves. Compass the arrival of the Dogon. By the 14th or 15th century CE, the Dogon people originating from further north, possibly the Mande regions, began migrating into the cliffs of Bandiagara. Why they came remains debated. Some oral traditions speak of flight from Islamization during the expansion of the Mali Empire. Others suggest environmental or internal social pressures. Whatever the reason, the Dogon arrived to find a place already marked by human presence. The Telem homes, shrines, and burial sites had been there for centuries, but they were empty. According to Dogon legend, the Telem were short, elusive, spirit-like beings. Some say they had magical powers. Others suggest they walked on walls or disappeared into caves. There is no clear memory of war or conquest, only the quiet impression of a people who had been there and had gone. The name Telem itself, in some Dogon dialects, simply means we found them. Derelict, reoccupation, and reinvention. As the Dogon settled into the escarpment, they began to build mud brick homes, often on flatter rock terraces, granaries with conical thatch roofs, sacred altars and shrines, crafted from white clay and animal horns, open plazas for masked dances and rituals. But they also incorporated older Telem structures. Some Telem granaries were reused, others were venerated as sacred. Telem burial caves were often avoided, feared, or spiritually respected. This layering of culture Dogon over Telem created a kind of historical palimpsest. The cliffs became both a home and a tomb. Every ledge bore two stories, the current life and the memory beneath it. Unlike in many conquest-based settlements, here there was absorption without erasure. The Dogon didn't demolish Telem structures. They built next to them, around them, or above them, as if acknowledging their presence, even in absence. thread cloth, and cultural continuity. Though the Dogon had their own textile traditions, they adopted and evolved many of the Telem's weaving practices. Dogon cloth weaving is still renowned today, particularly strip-woven cotton fabric sewn into larger panels. Mud dyeing techniques, known as boggle and fini, using fermented mud and tannin-rich plant extracts. Symbolic motifs, representing cosmological concepts, spirits, or stories. These techniques echo the textile sophistication of the Telem, whose burial cloths show similarly advanced weaving and dyeing. Though the Dogon language and mythologies differ, it's plausible that practical weaving knowledge like loom construction or dye recipes passed across generations, even as cosmologies diverged. In this sense, the Telem live on not just in cloth, but in the hands that still make it. Mage ritual memory and myth-making. The Dogon spiritual system is famously intricate, filled with cosmological beings, ancestor worship, and cyclical ceremonies. Many of these rituals revolve around the Namo, ancestral water spirits, the Sigwi festival, a massive multi-year ritual cycle, masks and masquerades, used to mediate between the living and the dead. Though these belief systems are uniquely Dogon, some mythological elements may reflect memories of the Telem. For instance, cliff-dwelling spirits still feature in Dogon folklore. Certain sacred sites are taboo because they are associated with Telem ancestors. Some ritual objects, such as granary doors, echo Telem symbolic patterns. This suggests that while language and belief systems changed, the spiritual geography of the cliffs retained its sacred weight. The Dogon didn't just live in the Telem's homes, they inherited their cosmological terrain. Broom, the archaeological unraveling. Beginning in the early 20th century, French and later Malian archaeologists began exploring Telem sites, especially the burial caves, which had remained largely untouched for centuries. What they found stunned the academic world. Mummified remains, wrapped in layers of cloth. Ceremonial bundles with beads, tools, and amulets. Granaries still holding ancient millet. Textiles, baskets, and wooden carvings, preserved by the dry air. These discoveries revealed a material culture of high complexity, and a burial practice unlike any in the Sahel at the time. And yet, because the Telem had left no writing, their story had to be reconstructed from layers of fabric and clay, not from chronicles or scrolls. In this way, archaeology became the voice of the voiceless, reading the texture of time, where language had gone silent. Sunrise over mountains landscape as archive. Perhaps the most profound element of Telem life is not what they made, but where they placed it. Homes built into the rock, defying erosion. Graves placed high above reach, protecting the sacred. Granaries perched where the air stayed dry. Paths carved into stone, now eroded into shadow. The entire cliffscape is a three-dimensional memory structure, a place where the arrangement of objects tells you what mattered. This is a form of record-keeping we often overlook in modern histories, not written but spatial, not linear but layered. To climb these cliffs is to walk through generations of memory, each step a footnote. The Dogon's role as custodians. Though the Dogon became the dominant population in the region, they have often referred to themselves not just as settlers but as keepers of the cliffs. They maintain oral traditions that preserve fragments of Telem stories. They continue ritual restrictions on certain caves and ledges. And in many Dogon villages, the oldest elders will point to a cliffside and say, "That is where the Telem sleep." In this sense, the Dogon have served as cultural archivists, not through academic study, but through lived relationship with place and story. Their respect blended with fear, myth, and reverence has helped preserve the Telem legacy, even without names or dates. They are memory stewards. Scroll what remains unanswered. Despite decades of research, much about the Telem remains unclear. What language did they speak? Where did they come from originally? Why did they leave, or did they change into something else? Were they a single culture, or a cluster of related groups? Without written texts, we rely on the material clues, textiles, tools, architecture, and the echoes in Dogon stories. But perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the Telem did not aim to be remembered by name but by presence, and in that they succeeded. Unresolved thought. If your entire civilization had to be remembered without words, only in the grain of wood, the twist of a thread, the placement of a body, what would you leave behind? The air inside the cave is still, ancient still. A narrow opening admits a beam of late afternoon light that falls gently upon a row of burial bundles tightly wrapped, layered in cloth, stacked carefully along the rock wall. Each is small, fetal in posture, swaddled in centuries of dust and time. You do not know their names. No carved markers remain, no inscriptions, and yet you know someone once placed these bodies here with care, with ceremony, rhythm, belief. This is the final chapter of the story of the Telem, but it is not just about the past. It is also about the present, about the archaeologists who disturbed these bundles, the institutions that now hold their contents, and the living Dogon communities who still see the Telem as part of their spiritual geography. It is a story about what it means to remember, and how we choose to handle the sacred when history, science, and belief intersect. Pick early excavations and scientific curiosity. In the early 20th century, colonial archaeologists and explorers, most notably French scholars, began investigating the Bandiagara escarpment. What began as ethnographic interest in the Dogon soon expanded into the exploration of the cliffside caves, many of which held perfectly preserved Telem burial sites. From the 1930s through the 1970s, these teams recovered dozens of mummified human remains, thousands of textile fragments, wooden carvings, pottery, and tools, organic material, including gourds, baskets, seeds, and mats. Many of these finds were removed and transported to museums in Europe, particularly in France, and some in Mali's national collections. To the scholars of the time, these were extraordinary artifacts, evidence of a civilization previously undocumented. But to others, especially Dogon communities, these were not artifacts. They were ancestors. Balance the ethics of excavation. The removal of burial items from sacred sites, especially human remains, has long stirred debate in archaeology. In the case of the Telem, the tension is sharp. Many of the caves were known and respected by Dogon villagers, even if no longer actively used. Some were considered off-limits, homes of spirits or hidden knowledge. Western archaeologists, however, often entered them without ritual, sometimes hiring local labor to climb into inaccessible ledges with ropes and baskets to retrieve mummies and bundles. In their view, they were uncovering a lost history. But in doing so, they disrupted living memory. Today, these ethical questions remain unresolved. Should Telem remains be returned to their burial sites? Can sacred objects be displayed respectfully in museums? Do descendant communities, even if not biologically linked, have the right to determine how these remains are treated? Increasingly, the answer leans toward repatriation, consultation, and consent. Because what lies in those cliffside graves is not just archaeological material, it is ritualized humanity. DNA, the limitations of scientific analysis. From a scientific perspective, the Telem finds are invaluable. Textile analysis has traced dye sources and weaving patterns back over 1,000 years. Radiocarbon dating of burial items has confirmed occupation periods from the 11th to 16th centuries. Bone studies offer insights into diet, disease, and physical labor patterns. But even with advanced tools, many questions remain unanswerable. What language did the Telem speak? What were their myths, gods, or moral codes? How did they view death? Science can describe, but it cannot always interpret. For that, we must listen to the land, to oral traditions, to silence itself. Mage the Dogon as cultural guardians. For centuries, the Dogon have lived with the memory of the Telem. Their oral traditions, while varied and sometimes mythic, consistently acknowledge the Telem as predecessors, spirits, makers of old things. In some stories, the Telem are said to have flown through the cliffs or vanished into rock. In others, they are credited with introducing certain agricultural tools or spiritual practices. Importantly, even today, Dogon ritual leaders avoid certain caves, citing their sacred nature. Some locations are approached only after prayer and never during particular times of the year. This is not superstition, it is living heritage. To the Dogon, the Telem are not gone, they are present in place. And this worldview offers a lesson that memory can be spatial, spiritual, and social even when names are lost. Thread the persistence of pattern. Though the Telem are gone as a people, their aesthetic legacy remains. Modern Malian textile traditions, especially in the Mopti region, bear traces of Telem weaving structure. Granary designs in Dogon villages mimic earlier cliffside forms. Mask rituals, though Dogon in content, use spatial arrangements that echo Telem cave positioning. Even without direct continuity, the material language of the Telem persists. This is cultural resonance not in words, but in shapes. Like the spiral motifs etched into burial beads, Telem memory wins through the present. Dove cultural reclamation and local involvement. In recent years, there has been a growing movement to involve local Malian communities in the interpretation and protection of Telem heritage. Projects now include training local guides and researchers, collaborative archaeological teams with Dogon and Bamana members, cultural heritage education in local schools, discussions of possible reburial and repatriation of remains held abroad. These efforts reflect a shift away from colonial extraction and toward community stewardship. Because ultimately, the cliffs belong not just to the past, but to the people who live under them, around them, and with them. Candle reflections on a silent civilization. The Telem built in stone and cloth. They placed their dead above the world, wrapped in layers of intention. They never etched their names. They never left scrolls or empires. And yet, we remember them because they cared how they were remembered. In the placement of a body, in the fold of a cloth, in the silence of a cave. They remind us that civilization does not need to be loud to be lasting. Final thought. When we think of civilization, do we think of the stone monuments that rise from the earth or the ones that cling to the cliffs, quiet, woven, and nearly forgotten? And if you could choose how your people would be remembered not by glory, but by grace, what would you leave behind? Story 5. Nok, the ceramic people who never spoke loudly. The earth is red in central Nigeria, rich, loamy, iron-heavy. It crumbles under the fingers when dry and sticks stubbornly to the hands when wet. It was in this soil, sometime in the 1920s, that a team of tin miners stumbled across something strange in a mining ditch near a small village called Nok. A terracotta head, almost life-sized, with stylized facial features, carefully rendered eyes, and the faint trace of what seemed to be a headdress. It was not a fluke. Over the next few decades, more were found: figures, fragments, heads, limbs hidden in riverbanks, farming fields, and ancient refuse pits. Some were broken, others nearly whole. All were hauntingly expressive. And yet there was no writing, no palaces, no gold, just clay, fired clay. These fragments belong to a society now known as the Nok culture, one of sub-Saharan Africa's oldest known artistic traditions. flourishing roughly from 1500 BCE to 300 CE. In this opening section, we descend into the quiet beginnings of Nok, a civilization that gave us some of the oldest African sculptures ever discovered, not as monuments of power, but as echoes of daily life, ritual and identity shaped by hand, fired by earth, and preserved by accident. The Nok landscape, a cradle of iron and earth. The region now identified with the Nok culture lies in central Nigeria, mostly in Kaduna and Plateau states, a zone of wooded savannas, scattered hills and broad valleys. The soil is red with iron oxide, and the terrain, while beautiful, is rugged. This environment is not incidental. The Nok people made their lives in a transitional ecological zone between the denser forests to the south and the arid Sahel to the north. This allowed for mixed subsistence strategies, farming, hunting, and gathering, access to iron-rich clays and ores, the movement of goods and ideas across zones. Their settlements, though not monumental, were often situated near water sources and fertile fields ideal for growing millet, sorghum, and other dryland crops. From this land, they extracted both nourishment and expression. Bricks, clay, kilns, and human form. The most famous legacy of Nok is their terracotta sculptures, hollow, hand-built clay figures created using coil and slab techniques, then smoothed, incised, and fired in open-air pits. They portray human heads with elaborate hairstyles and facial markings, full-body figures seated or standing, some with hands raised or crossed, animal depictions including monkeys, elephants, and birds, miniature objects, possibly toys or ritual items. What makes them striking is not their realism but their stylization. Triangular or almond-shaped eyes, often pierced through, D-shaped mouths, highly detailed hair, jewelry, and facial features, symmetrical patterns carved into cheeks, foreheads, and torsos. These are not caricatures, they are portraits of cultural identity. Though we do not know the names of the people depicted, each sculpture feels personal, composed, and intentional, as if to say, this is what it meant to be part of us. Test tube, a civilization rediscovered too late. Most Nok artifacts have been found not through archaeology, but through chance and erosion. The combination of tin mining, road construction, and illegal looting has unearthed hundreds, possibly thousands of pieces, many of them removed without documentation. By the time serious archaeological excavations began in the 1940s-50s, notably led by Bernard Fagg, a British archaeologist, much of Nok's context had already been lost. No cities, no graves, no temples, just figures scattered. This has made dating and interpretation difficult, but through radiocarbon analysis of charcoal and organic material found near some figurines, scholars have placed the earliest Nok artifacts to around 1500 BCE, with the culture gradually declining by 300 CE. This makes Nok older than classical Greece, and one of the earliest sub-Saharan African societies to leave behind complex figurative art. And yet, because they built with clay, not stone, their memory eroded until it was recovered by accident. Hammer, early ironworkers. Some archaeologists suggest the Nok were among the earliest iron-using societies in West Africa. Iron slag and smelting furnaces have been found at Nok sites. Charcoal samples used for smelting date to as early as 500 BCE, possibly earlier. Tools found near figurine deposits include hoes, knives, and anvils. Whether the Nok invented iron metallurgy independently or acquired it through trade and adaptation remains debated. But what is clear is this: they worked with fire and form for both function and beauty. Their kilns and furnaces were not far apart. The same people who smelted tools also shaped sculpture. Thread art for whom? Why did the Nok make these sculptures? With no written records or surviving ritual spaces, scholars have proposed several possibilities. Ancestor veneration. Many sculptures show serene, composed expressions suggesting they may represent venerated ancestors, placed in homes or shrines. Grave markers. Some figures have been found in association with burial goods or grave-like depressions, though most contexts were destroyed before they could be studied. Ritual or healing practices. Certain figures show diseases, deformities, or injuries including elephantiasis or facial palsy. This suggests they may have been used in ritual healing or spiritual mediation. Status symbols or initiation. Elaborate hairstyles and jewelry hint at ranked social structures. Sculptures may have served in rites of passage or as representations of social roles. What is striking is the absence of aggression. Few figures carry weapons. Most are calm, introspective, or contemplative. This is art not for war, but for memory, reverence, and recognition. The animals of Nok. Alongside the human figures are animal sculptures, including monkeys, often depicted climbing or holding objects. Elephant, sometimes stylized with exaggerated trunks. Birds perched or flying. These may symbolize totemic or spiritual identities, symbolic relationships between humans and animals, storytelling traditions now lost to time. Their inclusion reflects a worldview where animals and humans share spiritual or cosmological space, a theme found throughout African oral traditions. They also show the range of Nok artistic expression, not confined to utility, but extending into the realm of meaning. Counterclockwise arrows button, what was Nok society like? Though little structural evidence remains, we can infer some features of Nok society. Village-based communities, possibly semi-nomadic or rotational in farming. Family or clan organization, given the repetition of certain facial features and motifs. Artisan specialization, as the level of detail suggests professional or ritual craftsmanship. Trade connections, as some materials like certain types of clay appear transported. And yet we find no signs of fortifications, mass storage facilities, centralized monuments, warlike imagery. This points to a society that prioritized cultural expression and daily life over conquest or central control. They may not have had kings, but they had artists. Unresolved thought. Why would a society so advanced in art and technology vanish so thoroughly from memory? Was it absorbed, displaced, or did it simply evolve into something else, leaving its clay faces behind as its only voice? The wind drifts over the fields of central Nigeria, and somewhere beneath your feet, a shard of clay sleeps. Once it was part of a face or a body, a hand perhaps. Someone had shaped it from red earth, smoothing it, etching the fine lines of a brow or a bracelet. Then they had fired it carefully, purposefully in the open air, letting flame and smoke bake memory into permanence. But time is not kind to clay. Rains washed the earth, rivers shifted, people moved, forests became farms. The body of a civilization slowly scattered until all that remained were fragments. And yet those fragments continue to whisper. In this section, we trace the afterlife of the Nok people, what came after them, what parts of their culture may have survived, and how their artistic legacy quietly shaped what followed. The Nok did not leave a written record, but the earth remembers for them. Repeat button, what came after Nok? Nok culture is dated roughly from 1500 BCE to 300 CE, a span of over 1,800 years. By the time their distinctive terracotta sculptures stopped appearing in the archaeological record, much of sub-Saharan Africa was entering a new phase of development. So what happened? There are three major theories. 1. Gradual cultural transformation. Many scholars believe the Nok culture did not collapse, it transformed. The people may have remained in the region, adapting their material culture and social structures in response to changing conditions, environment, population, trade routes, or spiritual shifts. This idea is supported by the continuation of terracotta figurines in later Nigerian cultures. For example, Katsina figurines in southeastern Nigeria appear by 500–1000 CE, sharing stylistic echoes with Nok. IF letter 1EB9 art, 12th–15th century CE, shows far more realism, but retains the focus on human portraiture and symbolic detail. Benin bronzes, beginning in the 13th century, feature ceremonial figures and royal iconography, but now in metal, not clay. While not direct descendants, these cultures may represent regional lineages that inherited or adapted Nok ceramic traditions. 2. Migration or displacement. It's also possible that environmental changes, such as deforestation or resource depletion, led to migration. As populations shifted south or east, their traditions may have fused with others. This would mean that Nok aesthetics, hairstyles, face markings, symbolic postures traveled with the people, even as their original sites were abandoned. 3. Cultural discontinuity and rediscovery. Alternatively, Nok culture may have ended abruptly through drought, disease, or social collapse, leaving their traditions buried until modern times. In this case, the connection to later Nigerian civilizations would be more archaeological than cultural, modern peoples inheriting land, but not memory. Each theory has evidence, and none exclude the others. What's clear is that the artistic DNA of Nok did not vanish completely. It lingered. Artist palette: the continuity of clay. Terracotta art never disappeared from West Africa. Across Nigeria and surrounding regions, you find small clay figurines used in household shrines, ritual sculptures buried under homes or fields for fertility and protection, ancestor representations, especially among Yoruba, Tiv, and Igbo communities, ceramic drums, whistles, and masks used in festivals. These forms may not be direct continuations of Nok, but they reflect a persistent aesthetic language. Stylized faces, emphasis on posture and gesture, use of symmetry and incision. Clay as a sacred medium, not just practical. It suggests that clay was never just material, it was a way of preserving identity, story, and presence. And that understanding may have begun, or at least crystallized, with Nok. Wrench, iron, and earth, twin technologies. Nok's legacy is not only artistic, it is also technological. As mentioned earlier, archaeological evidence suggests that Nok people were among the earliest iron smelters in West Africa. This technology may have spread from them to neighboring regions, giving rise to more efficient agriculture through iron hoes, sickles, more durable tools and weapons, social changes based on control of metallurgy. Iron and terracotta are rarely linked in global histories. One is for work, the other for beauty. But in Nok, both came from the earth, both required fire and patience, both were shaped with intention and skill. It's possible that the same artisan cast iron tools and molded ancestral figures, switching between utility and reverence. That kind of dual mastery suggests a society deeply attuned to transformation, not just of materials, but of meaning. Classical Nok in modern memory. The modern rediscovery of Nok has been slow, uneven, and at times exploitative. From the 1940s onward, looting of Nok sites became widespread, driven by the international art market's hunger for primitive sculpture. Many of the finest Nok pieces in museums today were not excavated by archaeologists, but acquired through dealers who removed them from their original contexts. This has created several problems. Dating gaps. Without context, it's hard to date the figures accurately. Interpretive loss. We don't know how or where they were used. Legal and ethical issues. Nigeria continues to request the return of looted Nok artifacts from foreign collections. Despite this, Nok has grown in national significance. It is taught in Nigerian schools, referenced in literature, and used as a symbol of Africa's deep historical complexity. To know about Nok is to remember that sub-Saharan Africa had civilization, art, and innovation long before external contact. Interpreting the faces. One of the enduring mysteries of Nok sculpture is the expression on the faces. They are not smiling, not grimacing. Most are composed, thoughtful, even serene. This has led to multiple theories. Were they portraits of ancestors in moments of reflection? Were they symbols of community roles, a priest, a farmer, a child? Were they idealized humans, embodying spiritual or moral concepts? Without text, we can only guess. But the consistency of form, carefully rendered eyes, detailed hair, attentive symmetry tells us these figures mattered. They were not toys. They were not idols in the European sense. They were likely vessels of meaning, personal, social, spiritual. In their stillness they speak. Compass Nok's place in global history. Too often, African history is taught as if it begins in the medieval period, with kingdoms, trade, and foreign contact. Nok pushes that timeline back by millennia. At a time when Egypt's new kingdom was building temples, Greece was developing city-states, India was composing the Vedas. The Nok people were firing figures in clay, farming millet, and possibly forging iron. This matters. It disrupts the idea that Africa was passive, waiting to be awakened. Nok shows indigenous innovation, local continuity, and complex identity without colonization, without conquest, without monuments. Just clay, just presence. Unresolved thought. If a civilization chooses to speak in clay instead of stone, in gesture instead of text, how do we learn to listen? And what have we missed? Not because it was never said, but because we never thought to look in the soil. There's something peculiar about clay. It is at once delicate and enduring. It breaks easily when dropped, and yet buried beneath the earth it can survive for millennia. It holds form. It records touch. It captures fingerprints long after names have faded. In this final section, we turn our gaze to the legacy of the Nok civilization, not as something static or confined to museum glass, but as a living tension between memory and erasure, presence and absence. Nok did not conquer. It did not etch proclamations in stone. It did not build pyramids. Instead, it left behind faces calm, composed, silent. It asked to be remembered differently. Amphora, the scattered legacy. Today, Nok sculptures reside in collections all over the world. The Louvre Museum in Paris, the British Museum in London, the National Museum of African Art in Washington, D.C., and importantly, the National Museum in Lagos, Nigeria. But the path they took to get there is deeply tangled. Much of the material unearthed between the 1940s and 1990s was looted, removed from the ground by private collectors, sold on international markets, and stripped of archaeological context. This has left Nigeria with a painful paradox. The world now sees Nok as a symbol of Africa's ancient sophistication. Yet the descendants of that soil were long denied access to the story. Though there is renewed effort to repatriate Nok artifacts, the deeper challenge remains. How do you reconstruct a people whose language is lost, whose homes are erased, and whose memory survives mostly as export? Adult medium teaching the Nok. In Nigerian classrooms today, schoolchildren learn about Nok alongside ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. Textbooks present. Their approximate timeline. Their terracotta mastery. Their role as pioneers of ironworking in sub-Saharan Africa. For many young Nigerians, Nok is both distant and familiar, an ancient root that tells them, you come from a people who shaped beauty before empires arrived. Yet the content is often skeletal, lacking in stories, lacking in names, lacking in emotion. This is no one's fault. It is the nature of archaeological silence, but it reveals an important truth. For history to live, it must be narrated. And for the Nok, the narrators are still few. Jigsaw modern reinterpretations. Artists, scholars, and cultural practitioners are beginning to reimagine Nok through contemporary sculpture inspired by Nok geometry, literary fiction that speculates on Nok daily life, documentary films and animations introducing new generations to Nok aesthetics, digital reconstructions using 3D modeling to recreate the figurines in their possible settings. These efforts don't claim to know Nok fully. Instead, they grapple with the gap, honoring what little is known while filling in the rest with informed imagination. It's a way of saying, if we cannot remember them precisely, we can at least remember them kindly. Stop sign the risks of romanticization. But there is also danger. In trying to resurrect forgotten peoples, we risk projecting our desires onto them. We might imagine Nok as a utopia, peaceful, wise, aesthetically perfect. Or, alternatively, we might use them merely to challenge colonial narratives, positioning them as proof that Africa had civilization too, rather than respecting their complexity on their own terms. To truly honor Nok is to sit with the ambiguity that we do not know what they believed, that we may never know why they vanished, that not every civilization leaves behind a moral or lesson. Some simply existed, and that should be enough. Bricks, clay versus stone, the medium of memory. Consider this. The Egyptians carved in limestone and granite. The Greeks chiseled in marble. The Chinese etched in bronze and jade. The Nok molded clay. This was not a limitation. It was a choice, or at least a tradition. Clay is accessible. It is shaped by hand, not hammer. It is closer to the body. It is of the earth, not above it. And perhaps that's part of the message. The Nok did not seek to be remembered through monuments. They shaped human-scale forms, each piece meant to be held, touched, experienced. Their art did not dominate, it accompanied. That's a different philosophy of legacy. Of a whisper, not a shout. In the grand narratives of history, we often valorize what is loud. Empires that conquer, kings who decree, inscriptions that proclaim. But Nok reminds us that quietness can endure too. A civilization can be remembered not because it sought glory, but because it left behind something meaningful even if no one was listening at the time. Their figures do not command, they observe. Their postures do not boast, they rest. They are not warnings or triumphs. They are reminders of a people who saw the human form as worthy of art. Person in lotus position, reflections on cultural silence. There are many Noks in history. Civilizations that did not build high or speak loud, that are known only through fragments and shards, that left behind no kings, no dates, no battlefields, just presence. To value them is to redefine what we mean by significance. Not everything that lasts had to conquer. Not everything that mattered had to write. Not everything that shapes us left a signature. The Nok did not seek remembrance, and yet here we are. Final thought. If the measure of a civilization is not in what it shouts, but in what it leaves quietly in the ground for others to find, then how many Nok-like peoples have we already walked past, simply because we were listening for the wrong kind of story? Story 6. The Kingdom of Aksum, Obelisks in the Mist. In the highlands of present-day northern Ethiopia and Eritrea, the morning mist hangs low over steep hills and sunken valleys. The air is cool, dry, and laced with the scent of eucalyptus. And rising from the earth silent, gray, and immovable stand monoliths. Stone obelisks, some over 20 meters tall, carved with doors, windows, and symbols that mimic multi-storied buildings, some still upright, others cracked and resting in pieces where they fell centuries ago. These are the stelae of Aksum, once the heart of an empire that thrived between the 1st and 7th centuries CE. But this is not the story of a grand empire told through conquests or endless wars. This is a subtler story, one told in stone, soil, and trade. A tale of cultural convergence, ancient logistics, religious transformation, and the long shadow of forgotten infrastructure. This section traces the origins and quiet rise of the Aksumite kingdom, how it was built, how it traded, and how it anchored itself in a geography both majestic and isolating. A geography of elevation and isolation. The Aksumite heartland sits atop the Ethiopian highlands, a rugged terrain marked by high plateaus, deep ravines, and seasonal rivers. It is fertile but fragmented, a land that resists uniformity. This terrain shaped Aksum's development in several key ways. Agricultural diversity. The highlands supported the cultivation of barley, wheat, teff, and enset, a hardy, banana-like plant. Water was relatively abundant compared to the arid lowlands. Natural defense. The elevated geography offered protection against invasions and gave Aksum a strategic vantage over trade routes. Isolation with access. While mountainous, Aksum was not cut off. It had access to the Red Sea via the port of Adulis, enabling maritime trade. This combination, internal resilience with external connectivity, would serve Aksum well. It grew slowly, like a crop with deep roots. Balanced the inheritance of Dumt and pre-Aksumite cultures. Aksum did not appear from nowhere. Before it rose as a kingdom, the region had already seen complex societies. The kingdom of Dumt, circa 8th-5th century BCE, centered around Yaha, built stone temples and introduced South Arabian scripts and cultural influences. A network of agricultural and trading communities had developed across the highlands, managing terraced farming and long-distance trade. There is scholarly debate about how direct the line of inheritance was between Dumt and Aksum, but archaeological evidence suggests the Aksumites borrowed and adapted South Arabian writing and architectural styles. They absorbed the infrastructure and social complexity of these earlier cultures. Rather than conquer, they coalesced a slow merging of power centers into a single, centralized authority. In short, Aksum was not born in fire. It was accumulated stone by stone, custom by custom. Anchor Adulis, the quiet power of ports. Aksum's inland capital could not have thrived without its seaport, Adulis. Situated on the Red Sea, near modern-day Massawa in Eritrea, Adulis was the quiet engine of Aksumite prosperity. Here ships arrived from Rome and Byzantium, bringing glassware, wine, olive oil, and currency. India sending spices, silk, and exotic woods. Arabia and Persia, trading incense, metalwork, and horses. Other parts of Africa, exchanging ivory, gold, slaves, and animal hides. Adulis was more than a harbor, it was a node in a global network. And unlike Alexandria or Carthage, it never shouted. It functioned efficiently, steadily, without fanfare. The port's taxes and tariffs fueled Aksum's growth inland, and its cosmopolitan population brought linguistic, religious, and cultural influences that quietly seeped into the highlands. Aksum's kings may have ruled from stone palaces, but it was the dockworkers, scribes, and traders of Adulis who kept the empire fed. Railway, the infrastructure of empire. The Aksumites are not often remembered for roads, but they should be. Carving routes through the Ethiopian highlands was no easy task, yet Aksum managed to establish trade roads between Aksum and Adulis, mountain passes connecting rural farming communities, way stations and storage depots, some of which may have served as toll points. These routes enabled the movement of agricultural surpluses, grain, honey, butter, trade goods, ivory, incense, textiles, military forces when needed. While little survives in writing, remnants of stone paving and terraced paths have been found along traditional routes still used by farmers and herders today. This infrastructure, humble and mostly forgotten, was essential. It kept the empire connected not just through power, but through motion. Aksum was a quiet machine, its parts dispersed, yet interdependent. Coins and quiet wealth. One of the most tangible legacies of Aksum is its coinage. By the 3rd century CE, Aksum began minting gold, silver, and bronze coins remarkable for a sub-Saharan African polity at the time. These coins show portraits of Aksumite kings, often crowned or holding a scepter. Ge'ez inscriptions, using a script derived from South Arabian roots. Christian crosses, introduced after the adoption of Christianity. Weight standards aligned with Roman and Byzantine currency. What makes these coins fascinating is their dual purpose. Economic function, facilitating local and long-distance trade. Symbolic function, projecting legitimacy, stability, and connectivity. Unlike later African kingdoms that relied primarily on barter or imported currency, Aksum crafted its own monetary language rooted in metal, minted in silence. These coins speak not of conquest, but of commerce and credibility. The stelae, pillars of ambition. And then there are the stelae. Dozens of tall obelisks, some weighing hundreds of tons, dot the Aksumite landscape. The tallest, still standing today, is about 24 meters high. The largest ever erected, now fallen, is estimated to have stood at 33 meters. These are not religious monuments, but likely royal grave markers, symbolic houses for the elite dead. Each stele is carved to resemble a multi-story building, complete with windows and doors in geometric symmetry. False doorways, thought to be spiritual thresholds. Small altars or platforms nearby, possibly for offerings. What makes them remarkable is not just their size, but their engineering. They were carved from single blocks of granite, hauled from nearby quarries. Transport likely involved wooden rollers, manpower, and pulleys, though no definitive method has been confirmed. Some collapsed during or shortly after erection, evidence of the thin line between ambition and humility. The stelae are the most visible remnants of Aksum's desire to memorialize without words. They are mute but expressive. And they were meant to last. Place of worship, religion before the cross. Before Christianity arrived in Aksum, the kingdom practiced a polytheistic belief system, drawing from local traditions and South Arabian deities. Known gods included Maram, associated with war and royal authority. Behar, possibly linked to the sea or fertility. Astar, a deity of protection or wisdom. Temples and inscriptions reveal that Aksumite kings performed animal sacrifices, constructed stone altars, and invoked divine favor before campaigns or agricultural cycles. This religious framework was not imperial or dogmatic. It was interwoven with daily life embedded in stone, water, and soil. And like the rest of Aksum's development, it was gradual, adaptive, and layered. Unresolved thought. How does a civilization decide when to build upward? When to carve skyward symbols out of stone, not to reach heaven, but to anchor itself in time? And if these silent pillars were meant to speak for the dead, what were they meant to say to us, centuries later? Morning in Aksum. You walk beneath the tall, silent stelae as golden light creeps over the horizon. Around you, the ruins of ancient palaces lie in partial shadow, granite slabs half buried in the soil, stone steps leading nowhere, fragments of walls, dust. But something new lingers here too, something that wasn't here at the start of Aksum's rise. A cross carved into a block, a prayer in Ge'ez etched in fatting script. and far away, the soft murmur of a Christian liturgy still chanted in a church that stood for over 1,000 years. This section follows the transformation of Aksum from a polytheistic trade kingdom to one of the earliest Christian empires in the world, and it explores how, in adapting to a new faith, the kingdom positioned itself between the Christian worlds of Byzantium and the Muslim caliphates rising to its north. Aksum never became a global empire, but it became something rarer, a spiritual anchor known across continents, yet rooted in its quiet highlands. Latin conversion of a kingdom. The year is around 330 CE. The Roman Empire has recently legalized Christianity under Emperor Constantine. In Aksum, a young king named Ezana ascends the throne, guided by a Syrian Christian tutor named Frumentius. Under Frumentius' influence, and likely due to growing contact with Roman and Egyptian Christian traders, Ezana declares Christianity the official religion of the Aksumite kingdom. This moment matters. Aksum becomes one of the first states in the world to adopt Christianity, alongside Armenia and Rome. But unlike Rome, Aksum's adoption was not tied to collapse. It was not desperate. It was quiet, deliberate, rooted in relationships, trade, and spiritual openness. Ezana's conversion is recorded in inscriptions. One refers to him as the son of the invincible Maram, an old god in earlier years. Later inscriptions instead proclaim him as king of the Aksumites, the people of the faith in God. The king changes, the script stays, history turns a page. Place of worship from stone altars to holy churches. With Christianity came new rituals, new architecture, and new ideas about time, space, and death. Yet the transition was not abrupt. Instead, it blended. Churches were built, sometimes over or near former sacred sites. Christian crosses were carved alongside older symbols. Burial practices shifted, but continued to involve tombs and monumental markers. This syncretism, the merging of traditions, is what makes Aksumite Christianity unique. It was not imported whole from Rome or Alexandria. It grew out of the soil of Aksum, shaped by its terrain, people, and rhythms. The result, a version of Christianity that is distinctly Ethiopian with its own saints, calendar, script, and liturgical language. And it began here, in the quiet court of King Ezana, who chose faith not with a sword but with a pen. Open book the Ge'ez language and script. The spread of Christianity also encouraged the development of written religious texts. The Aksumites already used a script derived from South Arabian origins. But with the Christian period, the script evolved into Ge'ez, a fully vocalized writing system more suited for sacred scripture and storytelling. Ge'ez became the liturgical language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, the medium for early biblical translations in Africa, a vehicle for preserving hymns, prayers, homilies, and history. Though no longer spoken as a daily language, Ge'ez continues to live in religious practice, making Aksum's influence linguistically immortal. It was in this script that Ethiopians first read of Noah and Abraham, of Mary and Jesus, not from a European priest, but from their own scribes, in their own voice. Anchor diplomacy with distant empires. As a Christian kingdom, Aksum found itself in a unique position. To the north, it maintained diplomatic contact with Byzantium. Letters survive indicating correspondence between Aksumite and Roman emperors. Aksum's position offered strategic value. A Red Sea ally who could influence trade and naval routes. A buffer state against Arabian and Persian expansion. A spiritual sibling, affirming Christianity's reach beyond Europe. But Aksum was never subservient. It held its own, choosing its allegiances carefully. Its coinage began featuring the cross. Its inscriptions merged sacred and political language. It had become a Christian kingdom with African roots and global connections. This diplomacy, however, would soon be tested by a force that would reshape the region for centuries. The rise of Islam and shifting tides. In the 7th century, a new faith began to rise in the Arabian Peninsula, Islam. Within decades, Islamic caliphates would control large parts of the Middle East, North Africa, and eventually even Spain and India. For Aksum, this brought both threat and opportunity. In the early days of Islam, the Prophet Muhammad reportedly advised his followers to seek refuge in Abyssinia, the later name for the Aksumite realm, calling it a land of justice and tolerance. This led to the First Hijra, a migration of Muslims to Aksum for protection. The Aksumite king gave them asylum. He asked no conversion. He respected their belief. It was a quiet act of diplomacy, guided by principle. In return, early Muslims regarded Aksum favorably. The first mosque in Africa may have been built near Massawa. But over time, as Islamic states gained control over Red Sea trade routes, Aksum's access to international commerce narrowed. Its power waned not through war, but through economic rerouting. The ports no longer buzzed, the ships stopped coming, and Aksum turned inward. Mountain retreat into the highlands. By the 8th century, Aksum's prominence began to fade. Not because of failure or invasion, but because of change. Shifting trade routes favored Islamic ports to the north and east. Environmental changes, deforestation and soil depletion, weakened agriculture. Political centers migrated southward, toward the future kingdom of Lalibela. But Aksum did not disappear. It retreated not in defeat, but in preservation. The Christian faith persisted in the highlands. Monasteries were built, manuscripts copied, pilgrimage routes established. And through it all, Aksum's memory remained alive not in conquest, but in liturgical time, repeated prayers, and the carved crosses still found on ancient stones. This was not collapse, it was transformation. The legacy of faith and resilience. Today, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church continues to chant in Ge'ez, hold fasts, and trace its origins to Frumentius and King Ezana. It stands as one of the oldest continuous Christian traditions in the world. And while the world often looks to Rome, Constantinople, or Jerusalem for early Christianity, it was here in the highlands of Aksum that faith took root, quietly, and endured. Aksum's story is not one of sweeping imperialism or violent conversion. It is one of steady transformation, of adapting beliefs without losing identity. Its silence was not absence, it was depth. Unresolved thought. When power fades but belief remains, what survives longer, the crown or the cross? And if a kingdom chooses to live on through liturgy, through memory, through faith rather than armies or monuments, is that still a form of empire? Time does not erase all things equally. Some memories fade like ink in rain. Others settle into stone hidden beneath soil, waiting to be found again. Aksum, the Highland Kingdom, left no dramatic collapse, no fiery battle to mark its end. Instead, it left echoes. This final section traces the decline and legacy of the Aksumite kingdom, how it withdrew from prominence, how its memory persisted in unexpected forms, and how its stone obelisks and quiet Christianity shaped Ethiopian identity for centuries. Aksum did not end with a roar, it simply grew still. Decreasing the slow decline. By the late 7th to early 8th century, Aksum was no longer the bustling power it had been for over 600 years, but it did not fall in a single event. Instead, its decline unfolded over decades through a convergence of forces. 1. Trade isolation. The rise of Islamic caliphates across the Red Sea gradually marginalized Aksum from key trade networks. Formerly central Red Sea ports like Adulis were now under foreign control or influence. Alternative trade routes shifted commerce toward the Persian Gulf and Arabian Peninsula. Aksum, once a bridge between worlds, became a quiet cul-de-sac. 2. Environmental stress. Archaeological and palynological studies indicate signs of soil degradation, deforestation, and agricultural stress in the highlands. The growing population may have outpaced the land's ability to sustain intensive farming. Drought cycles in the region may have further strained food systems. The hills that had once cradled Aksum's prosperity now became a burden to maintain. 3. Internal migration. Rather than collapsing outright, Aksum's political and religious centers migrated southward. Over time, Lalibela, Gondar, and other cities became new centers of Ethiopian civilization. The Solomonic dynasties that followed would trace their roots back to Aksum, even as they lived elsewhere. Aksum did not disappear, it simply stepped back. Synagogue, the memory carried in churches. The real endurance of Aksum lies in its religious institutions. While the kingdom's economy faded, its Christian identity deepened. Monasteries flourished in remote mountain regions. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church preserved scriptures in Ge'ez. Oral traditions and sacred architecture kept memory alive. Perhaps the most poetic continuity is the Church of St. Mary of Zion in Aksum, which local tradition claims houses the Ark of the Covenant. While its historical authenticity remains debated, the belief itself carries meaning. It links Aksum not only to biblical antiquity, but to a sacred geography rooted in soil and silence. In a world of fallen empires, Aksum's faith remained unbroken. Its power waned, but its identity endured. The castles that came later. Centuries after Aksum's decline, Ethiopia entered a new imperial era. The Zagwe dynasty, 12th–13th centuries, built rock-hewn churches in Lalibela, evoking Aksumite stonework. The Solomonic dynasty, 13th–20th centuries, claimed descent from King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, rooting their legitimacy in Aksumite myth and memory. In Gondar, castles rose, but they too borrowed styles from ancient Aksumite foundations. What does this tell us? That even as rulers moved on, they still looked back toward the stele, the crosses, the language of stone. Aksum had become a historical touchstone, not through dominance but through resonance. Echoes in national identity. Fast forward to the 19th and 20th centuries. As colonial powers carved up Africa, Ethiopia remained independent, resisting European conquest at the Battle of Adwa in 1896. This resistance was not only military, it was also cultural. Leaders like Emperor Menelik II and Haile Selassie I invoked Aksum as a symbol of Ethiopia's ancient legitimacy. A Christian kingdom older than many European ones. A written language and script older than English or French. A tradition of sovereignty that had never been fully broken. Aksum's quiet story became a shield protecting Ethiopia's identity in a colonial world. It wasn't just remembered, it was used. The return of the obelisk. For many years, one of Aksum's largest obelisks, known as the Obelisk of Aksum, stood in Rome. It had been taken by Mussolini's forces in 1937 during the Italian occupation of Ethiopia. For decades, it stood in the Piazza di Porta Capena, far from its homeland. But in 2005, after prolonged diplomatic efforts, the obelisk was finally returned to Ethiopia and re-erected in Aksum. Its return was not just a matter of archaeology, it was a symbolic act. A reclamation of heritage. A recognition of historic injustice. A reconnection of stone to soil. Today, the obelisk stands once more among its siblings, in the same earth from which it was carved 1,700 years ago. It has come home, quietly. Bricks the stones that still speak. Travelers who visit Aksum today find more than just ruins. They find inscriptions in Ge'ez, partially worn, speaking of kings and gods. Underground tombs, some open to the sky, others still sealed. Sculptural fragments, half buried, untouched for centuries. Children playing near the stele, unaware they are walking through history. Aksum is not a grand tourist destination. It is not surrounded by global fanfare, but it remains sacred and steady in the way that only old places can be. And perhaps that is the truest measure of its endurance. Person in lotus position reflection, a legacy without noise. When we think of ancient power, we often think of drama. The fall of Rome, the burning of Carthage, the collapse of Babylon. But Aksum does not fit that mold. It rose quietly, traded steadily, believed deeply, and faded slowly. Its grandeur lies not in what it shouted, but in what it left behind without fanfare. Pillars carved to resemble homes, a language still sung in sacred halls, coins that traveled across seas, a faith that anchored generations. Aksum's story is not about what was destroyed, it is about what was preserved. Final thought. If history is often told through what was lost, then what do we learn from a civilization that refused to vanish, one that changed shape, changed place, but never stopped whispering its name?